Wang Shun's friends immediately started acting like innocent kids. The three of them were crying and screaming, convincing their relatives that they had almost been beaten to death. The enraged villagers assured the boys that no one could harm Wangkun village with impunity, and they would take revenge on those who had allowed themselves to do this to their children. Chen Kexin speculated that Wang Tuozi did not call his son, but simply warned his men, before provoking a conflict between them and the gang. Chen Li asked what the instructions would be. He feared that the girls might get hurt in the big one. Besides, he didn't want to beat up the entire village. Ye Wutian regretfully admitted that he had underestimated Tuozi. After all, he clearly wants to further inflame relations with the villagers, and they should not respond to their provocations. The leader of the hooligans, sobbing, pointed the villagers to Dr. Ye's team and exclaimed that it was those outsiders who had stormed into the village and beaten them to a bloody pulp. The angry residents lashed out at the outsiders and started yelling that those guys were always polite and well-meaning, and they had just come and intimidated them to death. Ye Wutian frowned and introduced himself. He told the residents the truth about the stolen lobsters and the beaten people, and asked if they thought what he did was wrong. All three of them started making excuses, saying that the young man was making things up. They couldn't beat up grown men. Wang Shun was a decent man. He would never do such a thing. The peasants ran out of patience and rushed at the strangers with pitchforks and shovels. They started shouting that Ye Wutian was lying, and that such a thing could not have happened. Suddenly, a growing roar of engines was heard in the distance, and a minute later, several men on motorcycles approached the house of the village head. The first to jump off his bike was Wang Shun. He shouted happily to his father that he was able to sell dozens of lobsters and had earned tens of thousands. They were in for a nice dinner tonight. Wang Tuozi panicked and irritatedly thought that his son had chosen a very bad time for his return, and now there would definitely be no conflict. Wang Shun seemed to have only now noticed that there were many people gathered near the courtyard. He was surprised to see the menacing villagers threatening the uninvited guests. Wang Shun approached his father and asked who all these people were and why they had come here. He had a look of genuine amazement on his face. Ye Wutian smiled at the peasants and said that they had seen everything for themselves, so he thought it was pointless to continue arguing. The truth had come out. The peasants were only now beginning to suspect bad things. A woman asked Shun if he had stolen someone else's lobsters. One of the men turned pale and asked if it was true. Wang Tuozi put his hand on Wang Shun's shoulder reassuringly and suggested that he had bought the lobsters himself in the city, rather than stealing them. The young man incomprehensively tried to understand what his father meant. At last, the boy understood the hint. He realized what Wang Tuozi was hinting at, and he immediately cheered up and looked proudly at the outsiders. After scratching his head, Wang Shun smiled at his fellow villagers and said that he had bought up all those lobsters from the fishermen in town. Of course, he had no thought of robbing anyone. The villagers who had trusted Utina again turned against him and shouted that he was an impudent deceiver and that they would not leave the village alive and unharmed. Chung Kexin hid behind the young man's back. The girl was worried that things had gone too far. Ye Wutian reassured her and said that there was nothing to be afraid of because Chung Li and the others had come with them. Ye Wutian tried one last time to break up amicably. He held his hands up peacefully and assured the villagers that he wasn't going to cause any unnecessary trouble for anyone. One of the men looked lustfully at Chen Kaixin and said that she was very pretty. He suggested that she go inside and talk privately for a while. This was the last straw for Wutian. The enraged young man shouted that they had brought this on themselves and ordered Chen Li to break the legs of all those insolent people. The bodyguard was just waiting for this. Turning around, he kicked the unsuspecting Wang Shun in the stomach with all his might. The surprised young man flew backwards a few meters. Before he realized what had happened, Chen Li was next to him and kicked his leg a little below the kneecap. The bone crunched loudly, breaking in several places. Wang Shun wailed loudly. Tears streamed from his frightened eyes. He grabbed his knee as if it would do something to help him. Only now did Wang Tuozi realize that these people were not joking, and he turned pale. He was beginning to regret having started to deny everything. The village head was scared for his son and called out to him. Sun Feng offered to give the fake gangsters a little beating. Zhuang Henglin's fists were also itchy, and she happily agreed to beat up those little rascals. Cutting through the air with a whoosh, Sun Feng's heavy boots slammed into the face of one of Wang Shun's comrades and turned his head slightly. Teeth spilled out of his mouth. Zhuang Hengling ran up to the other guy and hit him in the face with all her might with her fist. The young man lost his balance and fell down. His eyes reflected fear. The peasants began to resent the strangers beating the locals in front of their eyes. The woman shouted that the men should respond by beating the intruders to death. A loud pistol shot sobered the angry crowd, and they drew back fearfully. None of them wanted to die because of a prank by the locals. A light smoke was dispersing from Chen Li's gun. The young man explained that they were not going to harm innocent people. He hoped they could keep calm and keep their distance. The woman, who a moment ago had been riling up her fellow villagers and calling for the strangers to be beaten to death, was now shaking with fear and screaming that they had a real gun. Ye Wutian asked if they could now calm down and have a normal conversation with him. The man with the pitchfork estimated that a gun license costs a lot of money. Meanwhile, Wang Shun couldn't find a place to sit because of his broken leg and turned from side to side, screaming wildly. He begged for someone to take him to the hospital. Wang Tuozi was stubbornly unwilling to admit his son's mistake and shouted that having a gun didn't solve anything, and they wouldn't be able to get rid of the villagers so easily. The woman cheered up and shouted that they could shoot the whole village and urged her fellow villagers to smash the cars in which the strangers had come. Chen Li asked Ye what they should do now. Wutian replied that there was no need to fight unnecessarily because all these village scum were just being used. Chen Li thought with satisfaction that he really didn't want to shoot innocent people. Apparently his boss is actually a sensible person. Meanwhile, Ye Wutian put a hand on Chen Li's shoulder and winked conspiratorially. He promised to show something more effective than firearms. He peacefully put his hands up and asked that his car not be broken. The young man said he was giving up and assured the villagers that they could still come to an agreement. Wang Tuotsu urged his fellow villagers to leave the outsiders alone because it wouldn't change anything anyway, and their children right now need funds for medical care. The woman screamed that the boy's leg should be treated and the uninvited guests should pay for the medical care. The man added that otherwise they would not be able to leave the village. He said the medical expenses would be 500,000 yuan. The village head demanded another 800,000 yuan as compensation for moral damages. Yao Wutian smiled slyly and said that he didn't expect to pay extra for justice to be served. The young man pulled a blue credit card out of his pocket with 2 fingers and explained to the villagers that the money was on this card. They could go to town and check to see if the money was there. Elder Wang Tuozi's expression immediately changed. He greedily reached for the card and said, "This is already a completely different conversation." His fingers fumbled for some kind of obscure white substance on the back of the credit card, and the village head asked in surprise what it was. At the same moment, a loud rumbling sound came from his stomach, but the headman didn't pay much attention to it. He leaned on his crutch and began to look at the credit card. Suddenly, Elder Tuozi smelled a foul odor. He immediately realized that someone nearby had a body problem, so he asked who did it. But, in fact, he was the problem. The people around him were choking, and one man said that Tuotsu was not so old that he could not control his intestines. Only now did the headman realize that he had allowed himself to be seriously embarrassed in front of everyone and shit his pants. He blushed and shouted that he didn't know what was going on around him. Ye Wutian smirked and said that the village head was so worried that he crapped his pants as soon as he managed to get free medical care. Wang Tuozi realized who was the culprit behind his misfortune and rushed to the young man, angrily accusing him of something the young man had done to him. The young man stepped aside and deftly tripped him. The village head couldn't hold on and fell down. Ye Wutian said that he did not want such a headman to touch him with his dirty hands. Some man laughed that the head of their Wangkun village couldn't handle his incontinence and pissed his pants. He added that the headman was not trying hard to save his face. Hearing these taunts, Wang Tuozi turned green with anger. No one had ever mocked him like this before. The elder didn't want to accept all of this so easily and ran up to Ye Wutian again. The pale and angry elder immediately demanded that everything be taken back. Without much effort, the young man kicked him in the face and reminded him that Wang Tuozi stinks, and the guy asked him to stay away from him. Falling to his knees, the elder suddenly felt that his whole body was trembling and he couldn't bring himself to stand up. He couldn't find a single reason that would make things clearer. Ye Wuqian smirked and walked over to the village head. He picked up his blue credit card that had fallen out of Wang Tuozi's hands. The young man approached the next victim. Wang Shun immediately squealed in fear as soon as he realized Ye was approaching him and tried to cover himself with his hand. He was sure that he was going to be beaten. Ye Wutian said that his father's condition did not allow him to take the money, so Wang Shun would take the compensation payment for himself. With these words, Ye held out the credit card to the young man. Wang Shun fearfully shouted that he didn't need anything. He was even willing to give up the entire 45,000 lobster sale proceeds. He begged to just let him go. Ye Wutian smirked contemptuously and told the hapless businessman that his lobsters were actually worth millions of dollars, and he had managed to sell them for a measly 40,000. Wutian said that Wang Shun's business management was perfect, so he should be the one to be compensated. He walked over and handed the blue credit card to the young man. At the same second, the situation repeated itself. After the characteristic rumbling of the stomach, everyone present began to plug their nostrils. They were short of air. Wang Shun got down on all fours as far as his broken leg would allow. He shared his father's fate and also considered himself disgraced forever. He was so ashamed that he had shat his pants in front of everyone that he just roared without hiding his tears. This life was worth nothing to him. Everyone was already laughing at them. The villagers looked at the disgraced boy with undisguised horror. The woman opened her mouth in astonishment and could not take a step. Ye Wutian was now walking straight toward the villagers with a credit card in hand. He reminded them that they themselves had just been clamoring for monetary compensation, so they could have it. The young man raised his hand with his credit card and said that the money was on that card. The frightened residents immediately parted in different directions, no one wanting to share the fate of the head. Wutian hid the credit card, smirked, and asked them to remember that they had refused the compensation themselves. After all, he had offered them money. It was just that the villagers hadn't taken it. The rising sound of a police siren was heard in the distance, and a minute later a police car arrived on the scene. The car door swung open, and Police Captain Jiang Xiaomei and her partner ran out of there. He left the entire case to her and modestly accompanied the girl. The villagers were happy that the police had finally arrived. The woman regained her voice and shouted that those criminals must be apprehended. They were breaking children's legs. Jiang Xiaomei looked at Ye Wutian and Chen Kaixin carefully. Then she shifted her gaze to the crowd, threatening them with pitchforks and shovels, and asked what was going on here. Ye Wutian explained that these people stole his lobsters, beat up his student and Wang Er's grandfather. He reminded Xiaomei that this area was beyond the control of the police, and asked why she was here. The girl said that they had received information about a city dweller, Ye Wutian, who was causing trouble in the village, so she came to see if he happened to be here. Xiaomei couldn't stand it anymore, and began to yell that he hadn't had time to get free, and was already looking for trouble again. She reminded him that he was being secretly watched. Ye Wutian smirked and said that he was done here. She could call the ambulance and send those creeps away. The young man felt that he had fairly chosen the punishment for those guys. Xiaomei exhaled and angrily said that she was already calling the ambulance anyway, and Ye Wutian should tell her absolutely everything that happened here. After 10 minutes, Xiaomei finished writing down his statement, and rebuked that even so, he should have called the police and waited for her to handle it all herself. The young man showed her the farm equipment scattered along the road and explained to the girl that they would lose a lot of people if they waited for the police to arrive. Jiang Xiaomei realized that Ye Wutian was right. She frowned and told the officer to also interview the victims and listen to their version of what happened. At that moment, the phone in the girl's pocket rang annoyingly. She immediately reached for it and answered the caller. Jiang Xiaomei listened to her interlocutor and turned pale. Her eyes were filled with genuine horror. She didn't believe it and asked the speaker again. Jiang Xiaomei hung up the phone and looked at the young man carefully. Ye Wutian asked what was wrong with her, since he was actually passing as a victim here. The captain pondered what she had heard over the phone and said thoughtfully that in this case he was indeed an innocent victim. Naturally, the confused young man couldn't understand what Xiaomei meant, and he asked the girl to tell him everything in detail. An ambulance convoy was injured in a recent road accident. 10 dead and 7 injured were found, and traces of Ye Wutian's involvement were found in the dump truck that caused the accident. Upon hearing this shocking news, Ye Wutian and Chen Kaixin froze in horror. Tears were streaming down the girl's cheeks. This was too cruel an act, no matter who did it. Xiaomei assumed that it was a premeditated assassination. The enemies were clearly targeting Ye Wutian. It was most likely the same person who had tried to kill him before. The young man immediately rushed to his SUV with an arrow and called out to Chen Li and Chen Kexin. He said that they needed to arrive at the scene as soon as possible. The car doors slammed shut and the 2 jeeps, accompanied by a police car, rushed to the scene of the accident. Ye Wutian realized that the man had been following him and knew absolutely everything about the young man. It seemed that he had deliberately provoked that conflict with the fishing village. Remembering the brazen bandits, the young man guessed that his enemies, having studied his methods and personality, had purposely spread rumors among Wang Shun's comrades. The lobsters were guarded by only 2 men, which is why poor old man Van Er ended up in a hospital bed after the beating. A frightened Li Wan Er calls Ye Wutian. Thus, he is cunningly lured back to the fishing village and provokes a series of events. After analyzing all of this, the young man couldn't help but admit that Wang Tuozi was very shrewd and could be at the head of the entire criminal plot. Chen Li realized that they were being set up by someone and offered old man Ning's help. Ye Wutian replied that there was no need to do that yet. They would try to handle it themselves. They were driving very fast and slowed down after only a few minutes near the scene of the accident. The picture was a terrible sight. The ambulance was overturned on its side, all the windows smashed out. The ambulance was overturned on its side with all the windows smashed out. In the other car, a female paramedic was screaming for help. A patient was lying in the intensive care vehicle, and a doctor was giving her first aid. A dump truck lay nearby, flipped over on its side by the violent impact. Screams could be heard from all sides, begging for help. One of the police officers tried to turn the vehicle over. Jiang Xiaomei and Ye Wutian and their group arrived on the scene and were frozen in horror. It was simply unimaginable, and no one could look at it calmly. Ye Wutian angrily thought that there was no need to do this. Innocent people had been hurt. The young man ran as fast as he could to the scene of the accident. Ye Wutian shouted to Chen Li and Sun Feng, who were rushing after him, that they should find everyone alive as soon as possible. They couldn't let them die. The young man asked Chen Kexin to dissolve all the pills the girl had with her in water, and then apply this viscous mixture to the patient's wounds. The first priority was to save the people. Chen Kexin listened to the young man and ran in the other direction with Zhan Henling. The girl was determined. She would do her best. Ye Wutian warned Xiaomei that the ambulance should not be called, because someone else might get hurt, especially people who are very badly injured and a regular ambulance can't help them anymore. The officer was surprised at how quickly and accurately Ye Wutian gave orders. The girl asked him to call her if the young man needed anything. The first thing Ye Wutian did was to run over to the emergency vehicle, which had fallen on its side. The leg of one of the doctors had been crushed by the weight of the vehicle, and he was moaning in a pool of his own blood, begging for help. The young man crouched down beside him and asked him not to say anything more and to save his strength. He began to perform the ritual of treatment. The patient clenched his teeth and tried not to moan. The young man tried his best to heal him quickly. Ye Wutian felt uncomfortable when he saw everything. After all, it was really because of him that all these innocent people had suffered. Jiang Xiaomei was giving orders to an officer at this moment. She shouted that they needed clear pictures. Not a single clue in this case could be missed. The girl thought that someone must hate Ye Wutian very much to set him up so badly for the third time using harsh methods. She realized that with such capabilities, Ye Wutian could have been killed a long time ago, not just framed. They were probably dealing with a psycho who was just playing around with Ye Wutian. 3 hours had passed since they had arrived at the scene of the accident. The exhausted Ye Wutian sat in the middle of the road, breathing heavily. His clothes were splattered with the blood of the rescued patients. Jiang Xiaomei handed him a bottle of water and said that she was impressed. After all, the young man had previously assured her that he couldn't save people, but only produced pills. The young man gratefully took the bottle from her hands and smiled. He asked the girl if she believed that people were actually born good from the beginning. Jiang Xiaomei pondered over his words. She had nothing to object to the young man, so the officer simply remained silent. The girl knew that he would explain everything now. Ye Wutian unscrewed the cork from the bottle and began to drink the water greedily. The water spilled past his lips in thin streams, but the young man didn't care. He was too tired. After dispensing with the contents of the bottle, Ye Wutian threw away the empty container and said that there was absolutely no need for him to become a doctor if he could help the whole world. After all, a big disaster just happened today, and that's the only reason he helped these people. But Ye Wutian is not going to position himself as a doctor. Xiaomei took out another bottle with the image of a red cross on it and began to pour a lot of water on her hands. The girl looked very sad and had her own thoughts. Ye Wutian was surprised and asked what the vial was and why Jiang Xiaomei was doing this. After all, she hadn't gotten into any trouble and clearly didn't need any help. The girl replied that it was an antiseptic. She often gets her hands dirty, so she carries it with her. Xiaomei gently took the young man's hand and applied the antiseptic to the damaged areas. Ye Wutian was touched by the girl's attentiveness and asked why Jiang Xiaomei cared about him. He was just doing his job, and was therefore genuinely surprised at Xiaomei's show of kindness. Jiang Xiaomei immediately blushed like a boiled cancer. This conversation was getting dangerous, and she shouted out whether the young man would wash his hands or if he didn't need to. Ye Wutian put his hands up and peacefully replied that he would wash his hands naturally and put them at the girl's disposal. Xiaomei calmed down a bit and let off some steam. At this moment, Chen Kexin came up to them from the back with a bottle of water. She almost roared when she saw her Ye Wutian laughing with Captain Jiang Xiaomei. Gritting her teeth in anger, Kexin thought that Ye Wutian was very quick to find common ground with everyone, especially since she and Jiang Xiaomei were more like a couple, unfortunately. Ye Wutian meanwhile put up his bloody hands, and Jiang Xiaomei began to pour antiseptic on them liberally. The young man washed them well, and they didn't look so horrible now. Wiping his hands, Wutian asked what evidence in the dump truck was in question. Xiaomei replied that the bank records showed a transfer of 5 million to a man named Luo Hongxing. Jiang added that the dump truck that crashed into the ambulance convoy and caused several deaths was registered to this man. Ye Wutian gritted his teeth. He pondered who could have set this up and what steps he should take next to get to his enemies as quickly as possible. Jiang Xiaomei assumed that his enemy would obviously incite reporters to interview him, and it seems to her that no later than tomorrow, his reputation will suffer again. To her surprise, Uchan found the situation amusing and he chuckled, saying that it would be okay to pin him once, but the third time in a row only makes him laugh. The girl was worried about Ye Wutian and asked him not to take everything that was happening to heart. She explained that the young man's anger would only make his enemy happy. Ye Wutian smirked unkindly and said that in that case he would recommend his enemy to have a little fun, as he wouldn't be laughing very soon. Xiaomei was right. The very next day, the news was all about it. Moreover, Kexen reported that someone had taken a video of Chen Li beating up the villagers. Ye Wutian assumed that his opponent was doing all this for the sake of the miracle beauty pills. In that case, he would learn what it meant to be a real villain. The young man asked Kexen to arrange to start selling the pills. This news should be publicized, as the limited edition will be distributed through a lottery. Chen Kexen was surprised that the buyers would be chosen randomly, and even have to pay half the cost of the product in advance. Suddenly, she realized. This way, no one would be offended, because the pills would be distributed randomly, and no one would be able to say that Ye Wutian had deprived him of the medicine. The girl excitedly told Ye Wutian that by doing so, it was as if they were declaring to their enemies that they wouldn't even dream of getting their miracle beauty pills. Wutian closed his eyes and smirked smugly. He informed the girl that he had a lot to say to his enemies and was literally counting the remaining hours until retribution. The news of the selective sale of beauty pills disappointed many people. Among them were 3 speculators who cursed the young man for his inability to make a profit. A girl in purple clothes was sitting on a spacious armchair and tasting wine. The man across from her held a glass of red wine in his hand. Enjoying the taste of the excellent wine, the young man in the open shirt sprawled on the couch and asked the girl if she had analyzed the ingredients. 2 slave girls stood behind him. The girl with brown hair and purple tips lowered her eyes as she finished the rest of her wine and informed him that her men weren't done with it yet. The enraged young man ran up to her and knocked the glass out of her hands, spilling wine all over the room. He shouted that he'd already given her too much time, and it was time to call it a day. The glass clinked and crackled as it flew into the wall, shattering into dozens of shards. The wine slowly spread across the light-colored wall, leaving a red stain. The young man stood in front of the girl with clenched fists. He warned her not to keep him waiting long. His patience was not limitless. The girl finally opened her light brown eyes, which seemed violet, and looked at the young man, reminding him that she didn't work for him. They are only cooperating. Lowering her head down, the girl added that due to the technical processing, Ye Wutian's innocence had been proven. The young man asked in surprise what she meant. The girl explained that the pill production is ahead of schedule because Ye Wutian sees right through him and starts to get defensive. The young man frowned and wondered if the girl had decided to make fun of him. He was not accustomed to jokes in his direction, so he looked at her sternly now. The girl smirked and replied that she could not and would not laugh at him, for there were few people in the world who had the courage to do so. The young man looked at her intently. At that moment, the girl's cell phone rang and she was forced to rise slightly from her comfortable green chair to retrieve it from her pocket. After picking up the phone and talking to the caller, the girl smiled and interrogated the interlocutor. She told him that the information received was very interesting. After finishing the conversation, she asked the young man to check his phone. The girl reported that their acquaintance had retaliated, and not in the way they had hoped. The young man turned to his slave girls and demanded of the girl in pink lingerie that she hand him the phone. The girl immediately bowed and ran to get the phone. In a few seconds, she was already standing with the young man's phone, holding it in her palms. He snatched the phone from her hands and turned away. The whole internet was abuzz with news about Ye Wutian and his video, which garnered many views. One of the links offered to watch the video and learn more. The young man frowned at the screen and decided to watch the video to see what else his opponent was capable of. He pressed the interactive button and started the video. In the video, Ye Wutian suggested that his opponent finally showed himself, and accused the young man of only knowing how to play dirty and of being cowardly because he was sitting in his hole. The young man said that his abuser was wasting his time. Apparently his mind is possessed by obsessions, otherwise the world would not have seen such a psychopath. Ye Wutian suggested that it was all because of the beauty pills. Showing the unknown opponent his middle finger, the young man assured that he would never be able to get his hands on them. After watching the video to the end, the young man became nervous and started swearing harshly. In anger, he squeezed the phone in his hand so hard that it began to crack and fall apart in front of his eyes. The young man was out of his mind. No one had ever insulted him so badly before. He swore to himself that the games were over now. After this, he had to find Ye Wutian and finish him off. The girl couldn't help but laugh. She couldn't calm down for a long time, and then she noticed that this Ye Wutian was actually quite funny. She asked the young man if he was sure he didn't want to laugh with her. The young man looked at the girl furtively. He was so angry that lightning flashed in his eyes. The girl said that the broadcast of the recording clearly involved the Situ family's media company. Otherwise, the video could not have spread so quickly. This only made the young man angrier. He growled menacingly that the Situ family was also involved, and looked at his fierce face in the mirror screen of the phone. The young man started running around the room and breaking furniture, shouting the name of his blood enemy. The round table flew to the other corner of the room. Running up to the large 4-meter-high arched window, the young man pounded his fist on it with all his might, and shouted that Ye Wutian was seeking death since he dared to do such a thing. Despite the fact that the window was made of shatterproof glass, it began to crack and crumble right before our eyes. The slaves clung to each other fearfully. The young man immediately ran to another window and repeated the procedure, shouting that he would definitely find and kill Ye Wutian. The glass rang loudly, shattering into thousands of shards. The building complex owned by the Ouyang family occupies a large area. There are tree sculptures in front of the high-rise office buildings. Ouyang Xinyue sat in her office and laughed at the same video. She found it very funny that Ye Wutian had actually made a public statement over the internet. One of her staff members entered the office and reported that the media company that released the video to the web is actually owned by the Situ family. Xinyue immediately became sad. This explained a lot of things. The powerful Situ family could afford to run a few minutes' worth of commercials across the country. Situe beat her to it and helped Ye Wutian with the roller, though the young man might as well have turned to her. In the evening of that day, Ye Wutian arrived to visit Situe. He stood in her room and looked around the penthouse. The girl herself was nowhere to be seen, which surprised the young man. Suddenly, a girl's voice sounded behind him. Ye Wutian turned around and saw Sita wearing a short black negligee. She looked at the young man slyly. Ye Wutian was embarrassed and asked Situe what was wrong and why she was looking at him like that. The young man couldn't understand what she wanted, as her revealing outfit was driving him crazy. Situ lifted the hem of her clothes slightly, and asked with a smile if the young man wanted to see what color her underwear was. A flushed Ye Wutian offered to get straight to the point, and said that he had only come to thank the girl for her favor. Situ continued to tease the young man and said she wouldn't let him watch. She offered to guess the color of her underwear, and then she would accept Ye Uchan's apology. The young man agreed to play with her and said he would try to guess, but asked her to prompt him if it proved too difficult for him. Situe put her index finger to her lips and said languorously that the young man could try his hand at their game. Ye Wutian couldn't help but admit that the girl had very beautiful legs. The mere thought of the black stockings that Situe could wear with this outfit made him blush. The young man lifted the hem of his negligee a little, and said that he really didn't mind looking, but if he saw more than he should, it wasn't his fault. Ye Wutian asked if the guessing attempt would count if he saw the color of the underwear directly. The girl blushed and said she would only let him see it after he guessed the color. The young man's throat was dry from emotion, and he swallowed convulsively. There was nothing to do because otherwise Situe would not accept his apology. The girl gently put her hand on his shoulder, and Ye Wutian said that she had suggested such a game herself. He assumed that Situ had white lace underwear. Situe laughed and admitted that she very rarely wore white-colored underwear. Ye Wutian saw that she liked this game. She even closed her eyes in pleasure. He wanted to get this over with quickly, and the young man assumed that the girl had black lace underwear on under her dress. Situ reacted instantly and replied that the young man had failed to guess again. Her eyes were still closed, as if she was giving him a chance to peek. Ye Wutian hesitated with the color choice for a long time, and finally suggested that the girl should be wearing pink lace lingerie today. Situe opened her eyes and said that he was wrong again. She didn't have to wear lacy lingerie. Ye Wutian gave up and lowered his head. He invited the girl to tell the right answer herself. The girl immediately jumped up from her seat on the sofa and moved so close to the young man that he could kiss her if he wanted to. Ye Wutian didn't realize what was happening to her. Situe blushed and languidly whispered in his ear that all his choices were wrong. The only correct answer was that she was not wearing underwear today. As a result, Ye Wutian's earthly body once again couldn't withstand the temptations, and he suffered a nosebleed. Situe grinned gloatingly. She was satisfied with her game. Clasping his nose with his hand, the young man exclaimed that his patience had a limit, and Situe should behave more carefully with him playing such provocative games. The girl smiled and informed him that it would be difficult for the young man to overpower her. She offered to talk about business, and asked if he was satisfied with the results of her activities. Ye Wutian smirked and said that he was already imagining the face of that person who had watched his video message, and promised to definitely return the favor. Situ sadly reported that at least the young man had a conscience. Her media company, on the other hand, suffered retaliation and almost closed down. This news stunned the young man, and he cried out in surprise at what could have happened to her company. Ye Wutian did not yet know what forces were involved in his game. The young man was upset that Situ Wei had lost his company because of him as soon as the video of him appeared on the web. Before that, he had no idea of the power of his enemy. Situ closed her eyes and pretended not to worry. She said it was just a loss of face and nothing to worry about. Anyway, it was all over now. Ye Wutian worriedly asked who could have done this to her and who might be behind it all. The girl smiled and rubbed her cheek affectionately. Situ explained that there was no need to worry about her. Ye Wutian couldn't do anything anyway. He hadn't grown to that level yet. The young man said thoughtfully that he did not want to be indebted to Situ Wei, as she had helped him many times. He took the girl's hand and asked how he could repay her for her kindness. Situ Wei smiled dazzlingly and replied to the young man that she was only interested in his beauty pills right now. But he wouldn't give them anyway, so none of that mattered. Ye Wutian thought puzzledly and exclaimed that it was within his power to extend the life of any member of the Situ family by another century. That was all he could offer right now. The girl was surprised and immediately stopped smiling. Her eyes opened wide in amazement. Situ wondered if she had misheard because it sounded more like a joke. Ye Wutian looked at the girl completely seriously and confirmed that he could do it before it was too late, and all her family members were alive. Situ Wei still couldn't believe his words. She froze in surprise, her chin held up thoughtfully. Her common sense told her that it was simply impossible. Nevertheless, Situ turned around and exclaimed on the run that she needed to hurry back home. Too much had happened in one day. Since Situ's house was far away, the young man offered to book a plane ticket for her. The girl laughed and replied that she had her own plane and that all flights were booked. Ye Wutian was getting more and more surprised. He asked why there were no free flights and what caused the popularity of their destination. Turning around over her shoulder, Situ Wei gave the young man one of her dazzling smiles and said that the effects of his beauty pills were far greater than he realized. Since Situ Wei had run away and said goodbye, the young man had nothing else to do there, so he headed to his old friend's house. Peng Ning lived in a large country mansion. He was happy to see the guy, but he knew he had a lot of work to do, so he asked about the purpose of his visit, because Ye Wutian was supposed to be busy with the medicine. The young man asked Peng how his investigation was going, and if they had managed to get on the trail of the man who had thwarted his plans several times already. Ning Peng immediately turned gloomy. At his powerful level, he knew that person's name, but the old man had no right to interfere or give Ye Wutian his name. Ning sternly said that the young man should not dwell on it. He should better continue to build up his own strength. Sometimes patience was more important than anything else. Sitting on the comfortable sofa, Ye Wutian pondered. Two people from different strong families had advised him to back off, and that unknown person who was beyond him was even more interesting. Ning said he'd better think about his beauty pills. They are so popular that foreign players have also started to act. Already dozens of spies have been caught. The young man didn't expect to hear this, and jumped up from the sofa when he heard about foreign spies. He asked the old man in surprise if he was sure. Ning Peng explained that this is the reason why he keeps telling the young man about the pills. Many governments are pressuring China in hopes of exporting the pills to their countries. The old man added that there are many spies in the country. He himself does not know how to identify them, but he is sure that they have all come for his beauty pills. Peng asked if the young man had noticed the large influx of people to Dongcheng from other provinces, especially foreigners. The old man said that among those spies who had been caught, most of them were Japanese. Peng angrily declared that they wanted to lead their China into disorder. The young man jumped up from the couch and joined the old man in insulting the Japanese. He indignantly said that the Japanese had been in their country since the beginning of this era, and it was really disgusting. Old man Peng paid attention to his words and asked him what he meant when he said era. Ye Wuchen smiled and pretended that he was just very tired and misspoke. The young man thought that in the future, the Asian alliance, which would include Japan, would dominate China. They would seek European integration with the West. The old man rummaged through his desk and placed a puffy envelope on the table. He said that inside were pictures of suspected spies, and that it might be of use to him. Peng warned that the young man should be extremely careful, especially with foreigners. His first concern should be for his safety. Wuqian agreed with his wise friend. The young man suggested changing the subject to a more cheerful one. He showed me a transparent bag containing a pink pill and reminded me that he had promised to extend his life for another 100 years. Ning Peng incredulously asked what one pill could do. Ye Wuqian promised to teach the old man a set of exercises a little later, and it wouldn't be a problem for him. Handing the pill to Peng, the young man said that first, he must draw a large barrel of hot water and sit in it. He had to keep the temperature at 40 degrees for an hour. Ning Peng looked at the pill and wondered. He asked if Ye Wutian was going to sell such pills as well as beauty pills. The young man closed his eyes and shook his head vigorously in different directions. He said firmly that he would not do it under any circumstances. Ningpeng was very surprised and asked what was the reason for such a decision. In the old man's opinion, selling these pills could help the whole of humanity. The young man explained that he was already going against God's will. The weather was good in one of Dongcheng's suburbs. Birds were chirping in the bright sky. There was a wide road in the midst of a green forest belt, and there was no sign of trouble. At one moment, several police crews led by Jiang Xiaomei arrived at the small, inconspicuous house. They jumped out of their vehicles and surrounded the building. With the safety off, the captain gave the order to storm the cabin. The soldiers immediately rushed in that direction. With a powerful kick of her foot, Jiang Xiaomei broke the lock of the door and kicked it open with a terrifying rumble. Behind her were the fighters ready to open fire if necessary. The captain shouted to the man named Luo Hongxing that he was arrested, and resistance was useless. She was very angry. It was because of him that many people were hurt. The room was a terrible sight, with plaster missing in places and only a wooden plank instead of a bed and a small table. Lo said they had arrived earlier than he had expected. The unshaven man put the uneaten cucumber aside and raised his hands in the air. Luo Hongxing said that they didn't have to worry. He wasn't going to resist the authorities. Jiang Xiaomei quickly pulled out the handcuffs from behind her belt and slammed the metal bracelets on the suspect's wrists with lightning speed. The girl recalled that he had been responsible for many deaths among doctors and civilians while framing Ye Wutian. The captain asked who was the person who ordered the crime. Luo Hongxing smiled and replied that Ye Wutian was the one who ordered him to do it, and the man was very grateful to him for this opportunity to kill people. His arrest was worth it. His eyes were running like a madman's. Hongxin shouted that they could throw him in jail. He was already ready for that. He had nothing to lose for a long time now. Jiang Xiaomei listened to him calmly. She had seen a lot of things during her years as a police officer, and it was not the first time she had heard this kind of shouting. Turning to the fighters, the girl orders everyone out of the room. She forbids entering the room, whatever they might hear. The officers were a little puzzled by such an order, but orders are orders. And the surprised soldiers, one by one, began to leave the building. As soon as the door slammed loudly behind the last of them, there was a terrible rumbling and cracking sound in the house. Xiaomei's blows made the whole house shake. After kicking the man once again in the face, the girl screamed that those doctors were innocent people and saved many lives. She was hammering him so hard that she knocked his knuckles to blood. Jiang Xiaomei yelled that all those doctors had families with children, and it would be hard for them to survive now. Luo Hongxing was on all fours. A lot of blood had already come out of his mouth. He smiled and asked me to hit him even harder, because it was wonderful to feel such pain. Soon, a beaten Luo Hongxing was sitting in the interrogation room. Even though he had almost lost an eye, he still kept smiling, and Jiang Xiaomei walked out of the room. She called Li Shuang over and explained that that man's case was very important. He had to be watched closely because of his tendency to masochism. Besides, we can't let him commit suicide. As she walked down the corridor, Jiang Xiaomei thought about the fact that Ye Wutian was uninvolved in opening the bank account. He would soon be cleared of all suspicions. Police Chief Xu thanked the captain for her hard work. Jiang Xiaomei replied that it wasn't hard at all and asked if anything suspicious had happened. The boss said that she had an assignment to escort a person. It's one of Jiang Xiaomei's acquaintances. A short time later, a police motorcade escorting the truck raced through the city with the roar of sirens. At the head of the convoy was a shiny sports car. The people of the city looked back at the column in amazement. One young man said that even the governor himself had not been escorted with such honor. One of the men remarked that the boys were wrong. Today is the day of the beauty pill sale, and the truck is full of them. The other man said it was a huge amount of money. The armored silver car was carrying Ye Wutian, as the man had assumed. He was accompanied by his bodyguard Jiang Xiaomei. The girl told the young man on the way that she had managed to capture Luo Hongxin. If everything went well, Ye Wutian would soon be cleared of suspicion. The young man smiled and said the girl worked hard and deserved a kiss. He reached for her, but Xiaomei pushed him away and told him to watch his tongue. She was at work. Uchan said resentfully that his lips were hurting and needed to be kissed to heal them. He reminded him that a bodyguard has a duty to protect his target. Jiang Xiaomei asked to remind her in the sales office in front of Chen Kaixin. She promised that she would take care of him then. The young man's heart instantly squeezed. The girl smiled and offered to call her affectionately baby in front of Chen Kaixin instead of formally addressing the captain. Let Kaixin know how close they were to each other. Wutian turned pale at the mere thought of their meeting and said that it was impossible for now. A little later, he would definitely persuade Kaixin to let Jiang Xiaomei become his concubine. The angry girl hit Ye Wutian with her fist with all her might, and he banged his head into the reinforced glass. Although the young man managed to put his hands out, he earned a bump. Tianjing Trading Group occupied a huge complex in the center of the city, consisting of many covered pavilions arranged in a circle. Inside it was a stadium. A large awning was put up there today. The pretty anchorwoman said she was happy to welcome everyone who had come here from all corners of the country and those watching on air. Several policemen stood in front of her, guarding against the crowd. The girl exclaimed that today was a special day, and she greeted everyone on behalf of the Tianjing Group. Camera lenses clicked from all sides. Cameramen one after another quickly adjusted their equipment. The girl in the purple dress continued to open the party. One of the men among the audience realized with amazement that representatives of China's most famous TV stations had come to the event. Ye Wutian and Chen Kaixin watched from afar. The young man was surprised to say that the girl had managed to completely fill the 80,000-seat stadium. Kexin smiled and said that it was quite an expected reaction after a public conference. She added that she did not aim to choose the biggest stadium in the city. The presenter continued to whet the audience's appetite and said that the boxes behind her back were full of beauty pills. The drawing of the pills was linked to the number of the audience's seat. The girl exclaimed that they were starting to sell the first batch of pills in the amount of 10,000 units. Multicolored pieces of paper flew into the air like streamers. The audience rose joyfully from their seats. All of them raised their hands in excitement and welcomed the beginning of the sales. Everyone wanted to get one of the beauty pills. Ye Wutian remembered his long and painstaking labor to create those 10,000 pills. Only now, looking at the excitement around the pills, did the young man realize that his efforts had not been in vain. Xiao Mei grudgingly remarked that he would make $1 billion on the sale of 10,000 pills. The girl demanded to buy her dinner, since she works for a few thousand. Ye Wutian turned to Xiao Mei and smiled. He said that the girl had nothing to worry about since he would take care of her for the rest of her life. Zhang Xiaomei immediately blushed and turned away from the young man. She shouted that absolutely no one would believe such nonsense. Tens of thousands of people came to the stadium to get at least one pill. There was a catastrophic shortage of police officers to maintain order. The whole country was watching the broadcast from the stadium where representatives from the provinces and other countries had gathered. Situ Wei watched the broadcast thoughtfully while enjoying her wine. Journalist Wang Fengxi watched the broadcast with rapt attention, plugging headphones into her phone and lying on her bed. There was another girl among those who were closely following the live broadcast. She was sitting at a computer. Her face was hidden under a mask and a hood. Her left arm was bandaged. Within 2 hours, all 10,000 pills were sold. In addition, Chen Kexin gave away 50 pills for free to keep up the interest, and sales broke out with renewed vigor. The stadium was very lively. All the stands were roaring enthusiastically. The patriarch of the Ye family stood in one of the front rows, followed by his son Heng Dong and his daughter Fei Chao. The girl was very pleased, and she pointed out to her father that there were not enough beauty pills for everyone. The man smiled and replied that her brother had come up with a good idea. The father of the Yi family frowned more and more every minute, and reproached himself for kicking the young man out of his family. Because of this mistake, he didn't know how to face his relatives. The patriarch couldn't contain his emotions and angrily slammed his fist on the podium, cursing the circumstances and the fact that his feckless relative was able to reach such heights. The Ouyang family was also in the stadium. Xinhui thought warmly of Wutian, happy that no one would dare to underestimate him now. The bidding was finally completed and the spectators left the stadium, where only the empty tent that had recently sold a miracle beauty and body product remained. Chen Kexin happily said that they had sold all the pills so quickly she just couldn't believe it. After all, she used to have to drink with her customers to make deals. Ye Wutian recalled that he had promised to create a business empire for her and said that this was only the first step. He asked the girl to visit Ouyang Xinhui and give her 10% of the shares. A disgruntled Kexin declared that there was no need to postpone her promise and she would get right on it. She turned around and walked away. Ye Wutian said that they had finished their work here and could finally take a break. Suddenly, Zhang Xiaomei's cell phone rang. The girl anxiously picked up the phone. Lately, all the calls were related to something unpleasant. It turned out to be so this time. She kept shouting into the receiver and interrogating the person she was talking to. It turned out that Luo Hongxing was dead, and someone unknown was asking to see Ye Wutian. Wasting no time, they ran out of the stadium and crossed the Tianjing Group's shopping center. Soon, their police crew was already pulling into the parking lot near the station. Li Shuang stood outside the cell where the body lay in a pool of blood. Zhang Xiaomei asked how it happened, and reminded the officer that he should not let Luo Hongxing out of his sight. She shouted what happened, whether someone killed him or it was a suicide. Xiao Mei asked if someone could have broken into the station and killed Luo Hongxing. Li Shuang listened to her coldly and calmly replied in an even voice that there was a murder here. His icy calmness gave her goosebumps. Ye Wuqian recalled that he had given information on the phone about the person who wanted to see the young man, and asked who it was. Zhang Xiaomei was standing there worriedly. Li Shuang leisurely reached into his holster for his pistol and retrieved it. He informed the young man that Luo Hongxing's assassin wanted to see him. He cocked the safety and pressed the barrel of the gun to his temple. In a cold-blooded voice, the officer admitted that he was the murderer. Ye Wutian looked at the officer calmly and tried to figure out what was going on. Zhang Xiaomei was really scared for the officer, but she didn't give up hope that he had just lost his head. She asked him to come to his senses, put the gun down, and explain everything. After all, the young man was still so young and had everything ahead of him. It was time to think about a family. Li Shuang did not respond to the girl's arguments. Continuing to hold the gun at his temple, he closed his eyes and apologized for letting her down badly. Zhang Xiaomei boiled up and shouted, demanding that he lower his weapon and explain everything. After all, he had served under her for 4 years and had never disobeyed orders. Li Shuang stated that there was only one reason why he was still alive. The young man was asked to deliver a message to them. Ye Wuqian looked at him perplexedly. He puzzledly asked Li Shuang what message he was referring to. It was all very strange. Li Shuang smirked and said just 2 words. The show had started. Zhang Xiaomei and Ye Wutian looked at each other. They were starting to get bored with this game. Uchan said that it was a very interesting message, but it wouldn't hurt to know who it was from. The young man was going to die anyway, so he could tell them everything. Li Shuang now looked scared. He replied that if he kept silent, only he alone would die. And if he blabbed, people would die, so he just had no choice. Xiaomei shouted that he himself was a police officer and should know that they would protect him. She demanded that the weapon be put down immediately. Li Shuang couldn't stand it and burst into tears. He confessed that he would have been happy to serve her in the future if the circumstances had been a little different. The officer pulled the trigger, and his blood splattered Zhang Xiaomei's entire face. The captain clenched her teeth tightly and berated herself for not being able to stop her best fighter. The gun fell out of the suicidal man's hand and resoundingly fell to the floor right into the pool of blood. Xiaomei stared at Li Shuang in shock, as if she couldn't believe that this could have happened. The girl moved closer to his body and stood over him for a while with clenched fists, trying to tell him all the things she hadn't had time to say in her lifetime. Xiaomei quietly muttered that Li Shuang had solved many cases together with her for 4 years. And all these 4 years, they had been each other's trustworthy companions. The captain couldn't take it anymore and burst into tears. Tears ran down her cheeks in streams. She couldn't believe that her comrade-in-arms Li Shuang had passed away like this. She threw herself into Ye Wutian's arms and cried out that she had to avenge her best employee. The young man looked at her sadly. Zhang Xiaomei was still unable to calm down and continued to sob inconsolably, sobbing incessantly. Wutian felt sorry for the girl, so he stood quietly and waited. Ouyang Xinyue's office. The office is furnished in a high-tech style. At a small glass desk, Xinyue sits across from Chen Kaixin, who has come to see her on business. Kexin took out the contract to transfer 10% of the shares to Miss Ouyang and said that she was here to fulfill Ye Wutian's promise. She asked her to sign the papers. Chen Kaixin was very uncomfortable to be here, because it just so happened that she herself had helped Ye Wutian establish a good relationship with Ouyang Xinyue. The girl didn't pay much attention to her. She carefully reread the terms of the contract and quickly signed all the pages. Handing over the signed contract, Xinyue thanked Kexin for her personal visit. She said she had been to the pill sales site and congratulated them on their success. Chen Kexin tried to smile at the girl and thanked Xinyue. She congratulated Miss Ouyang for being their big auctioneer now. The girls cost each other. Each of them felt that the other was a rival, and they both tried to soften the situation with a strained laugh. When the mutual compliments were over, there was an awkward pause. The girls had nothing more to say to each other's eyes, so they fell silent. Finally, Ouyang Xinyue dared to break the silence, and she asked Chen Kexin if she could ask the girl a question of a very personal nature. Kaixin happily agreed. Xinyue recalled that Ye Wutian wanted to break the engagement with her, but Kaixin still clung to him. This was incomprehensible to Miss Ouyang, because Wutian had caused Chen Kexin a lot of problems. The girl smiled and answered that she couldn't let him go. He had appeared beside her in a difficult moment and supported her, so she could not let him go without finding out the reason. Ouyang Xinyue suspected that this could only mean one thing. Her face immediately became saddened, and the girl assumed that Ye Wutian and Chen Kaixin were happy to be together. Chen Kaixin blushed at the mere memory of the young man. She dreamily closed her eyes and said that she was very happy. Ye Wutian treats her very well. This completely killed Xinyue, but the girl was too strong to show this to her rival, and she mumbled that Chen Kaixin deserved it. The next day, Ye Wutian was riding the transparent elevator up the building. Sales were rapidly gaining momentum, and expansion had to be taken care of. When the elevator arrived on the right floor and the doors opened after a distinctive bell, the young man thought he was on the wrong floor. There were long-legged beauties standing around, one better than the other. Ye Wutian opened his mouth in surprise. After all, one would have thought that he had gone to a paradise full of beautiful girls for his merits while he was still alive. His office was jammed with applicants. The entire lobby was crammed with applicants who wanted to work for him. The young man looked contentedly at the sea of girls and realized that he would enjoy making his way to his office, jostling among the female bodies. Ye Wutian decided not to waste any time and ran straight ahead while the girls still had time to disperse in different directions. He felt like he was really in paradise. Ye Wutian shushed the girls and apologized left and right, not forgetting to touch another girl. Sweating from such a temptation in close proximity, Ye Wutian tried to carefully walk past them. Suddenly, the young man cried out that someone had put their hands on his buttocks and exclaimed that they shouldn't feel sorry for him, they should press harder against him. The embarrassed Ye Wutian advanced closer and closer to his office, pressing his elbows against his torso so as not to accidentally hurt anyone. His enjoyment was interrupted by Chen Kaixin's appearance. She walked out of the office with a clipboard in her hand and sternly asked everyone to disperse, warning that someone was going to get hurt if this continued. The young man tried to justify that he had to fight his way through the crowd and suffer humiliation because life always prevents lovers from meeting. Such is the bitterness of life. Kexin immediately grabbed his cheek with her free hand and suggested that he hadn't had enough of that bitterness in his life. Chen Kaixin dragged Wutian unceremoniously by the cheek, saying that they urgently needed to go to the fairs, and the young man could barely keep up with her. He asked, treating him a little more gently. The young man sat down on the sofa and rubbed his red cheek. He asked Chen Kexin what was even going on under their office. The girl said that the sale was successful and their revenue reached 10 billion in one morning. Therefore, they could no longer cope and had to expand their staff. Ye Wutian smiled smugly and said that this was to be expected. In the future, the company will expand and it is better to spend another 10 billion on it. Suddenly, he realized something. It turns out that all those beautiful girls came to their office to apply for a job. The young man smiled and said that Kexin had learned his habits well. Kaixin smirked and said in a high-pitched tone that the harem was for him. Wutian caught her mood and immediately joked that he had never thought of those girls. The young man added that none of them could match her beauty. Kexin frowned and said that this situation only arose because all their staff members were busy. Kexin added that they should raise the requirements. They need highly educated young girls. In addition, there are very few applications from men, but there are a lot of beautiful foreign women. Ye Wutian was wary when he heard about the foreign women. He was sure that he had seen one of them before, but he couldn't remember where. A vague suspicion rose in the young man's mind, and he rushed to the desk, not believing his guess. Chen Kaixin looked at him in surprise. Ye Wutian took out the envelope Old Man Ning handed him and spread the photos of the potential spies on the table. He asked if there were any photos of the female candidates. Kexin showed some photos of the girls who were scheduled for interviews in the afternoon, and confusedly asked why he needed photos of foreign women. Ye Wutian angrily slammed his fist on the table and shouted that they were all spies. He couldn't believe that the sale was only yesterday, and today the office was full of spies. Chen Kexin finally understood the enemy's entire plan, and she felt uneasy. The frightened girl knew what would happen if anyone found out about the recipe and smuggled it out of the country. She said she would order that no suspicious individuals be allowed out of the building. After all, the people they trusted most should be in key positions. Xiao Man, the girl's secretary, knocked on the office door and said that she had come. Chen Kaixin allowed her to enter. The girl said hello confusedly and said that the top managers of the Qiaojun group had arrived, along with their head. They insisted on meeting in person. Chen Kexin exclaimed in surprise that the Qiaojun group is affiliated with China and they have very strong support from the government. The girl invited the honored guests into the meeting room, and all three representatives took their seats at the table opposite Ye Wutian and Chen Kaixin. The first to speak was Li Qitao, a representative of the Qiaojun group. The man with glasses said that beauty pills are talked about absolutely everywhere, not only in their country but all over the world. He smiled and remarked that he wasn't sure they could sustain such a turnover of the drug. The importance of the pills had increased, and now it intersected with state interests. Ye Wutian smirked and assumed that Representative Li Qitao meant that someone else wanted to take over the guarding of the medicines besides himself. The representative laughed and said that the young man was very witty. He said that their group had decided to buy all the pills from their company for a large price. Li Qitao paused and folded his hands in a lock in front of him, enjoying the effect he had produced. The representative said that they were willing to give 5 billion. Chen Kexin frowned. Only a fool could agree to give these pills for 5 billion. After all, they would soon have tens of times more. Ye Wutian smirked contemptuously and asked why he was being offered a measly 5 billion. He wondered why Li Qitao was so undervaluing his pills. The representative realized that the young man was not easy and nodded contentedly. He agreed that it was necessary to bargain for such goods and asked what price Director Yi set. Ye Wutian immediately raised his hand with 2 bent fingers and said in a firm voice, looking at his interlocutor carefully, that he was willing to give up the goods for 300 billion yuan. Li Qitao's representative was so outraged that he stood up from the table and shouted that Ye Wutian's entire company couldn't be worth 300 billion. The young man stood up and shouted, proving that it was a fair price. He said that he had deposited 10 billion just this morning, and they were only offering 5 billion. The representative slowed down and explained that he had come here on orders from his superiors. He could throw in a little extra if the young man wasn't rude, or he wouldn't give him $100. Chen Kaishin turned white. If the Chinese elite were pawns in someone else's hands, it meant that the real player was behind the scenes and didn't want to show himself. Ye Wutian contemptuously said that they had 3 seconds to clear the room. Otherwise, they might end up in the hospital for months. The managers and the representatives stood up from the table and looked at the young man with hatred. Li Qitao turned around in the doorway and exclaimed that Ye Wutian had asked for it himself. Chen Kaishin took the young man's hand and fearfully asked if they should have been so impulsive. She added that the room wasn't suitable for fighting either. Ye Wutian explained that the guests simply left him no choice. After all, it was clear that they wanted to buy the pills for nothing. The young man assured the girl that he would personally take care of everything. Chen Kexin thoughtfully suggested that they might have gone to get the raw materials for the pills. After all, whoever owns the raw materials sets the price. Ye Wutian smirked and explained that they would simply stop buying raw materials if the price went up. He added that he had been waiting for this to happen and had purchased enough materials to last another year. On the other hand, they themselves needed raw materials and could not allow others to profit from them. It was necessary to increase the quantity of raw materials. The Situ family villa was located outside the city and was a huge 3-story mansion with several summer decks and an extensive underground parking lot. The head of the Situ Zong family was sitting on the sofa, poring over a rosary. He thoughtfully asked his granddaughter Situ Wei how sure she was that Ye Wutian had told her the truth. The girl replied that she trusted 70%. She recalled that he had created the beauty pills himself, and it was just an incredible level of medical skill. Situ Jie, the girl's father, joined the conversation. He was skeptical that the young man could extend their lives for another 100 years and suggested that they investigate first. Situ Wei broke down into a scream. She was offended that even her own father didn't believe her words. The girl reminded him that the Ouyang family was already 1 step ahead of them and was profiting from it. Jie tried to object that the pills were only shared with Xin Yue. Situ Wei suggested that this was just the beginning. If the Ouyang family got into trouble, Xin Yue would immediately rush to the rescue. Situ Zong thought about it and said that old man Ouyang was not old anymore. He asked Situ Wei if Ye Wutian could cure Ouyang Anan. Situ Wei thought briefly and replied that the chances of cure were very high. Ye Wutian's medical ability could not be evaluated by any means known to them. Jay said he was only interested that the Ye Wutian they knew had changed so much. Wei confessed that she did DNA testing using his hair. It's exactly the same person. Situ Jie weighed the pros and cons. It was unclear where the young man had gotten such skills and why he was hiding. He told his daughter that he couldn't trust such a mysterious guy. The patriarch immediately understood his son's hint. He sighed heavily and politely asked his granddaughter to give them a chance to discuss it alone. Situ Wei wasn't entirely happy with their decision, but she realized that her statement really did sound too fantastic to be believed unconditionally. The girl in the purple dress returned from the lab to the young man in the open shirt. She saw that he was in the room by himself and wondered where the girls had gone. The young man smirked and said that those 2 girls were broken and needed to be replaced. He added that if you had money, you could buy yourself anything you wanted. The young man asked the guest how the tests were done. He wanted to hear the correct result. The girl said that she was not able to perform the analysis and was surprised by it. She remarked that if this happened, Ye Wutian would make a lot of money, and they wouldn't get anything themselves. The girl smirked and suggested trying other methods. The young man looked thoughtfully at his feet and assumed that the girl wanted to set Wuchen up with a honey trap. It seemed like a good idea to him. The girl stared into the young man's eyes for a few seconds, pondering his proposal. She said that Ye Wutian was cunning and unlikely to fall for it. The young man turned red with anger. In all this time, the girl had not helped him in any way. He shouted that she might accidentally burn herself while playing with matches. The girl thanked him for his concern and told him that he should think of himself first, for his family did not share his methods. He snapped back that it was his business. The girl asked fearfully what he intended to do, for they did not know the composition of the pill. She shouted that he would not be able to copy the beauty pill completely. The young man smirked smugly and explained that he was going to launch his product to the masses and discredit Ye Yutian. The girl jumped up from her chair and angrily stated that innocent people would suffer in such a case. The young man cynically stated that people's deaths were a small thing, and he didn't want to miss the chance. The girl turned around and said angrily that she wasn't going to support him anymore. If he wanted to, he could go on, but he could go it alone. The young man sat thoughtfully with the back of his hand against his cheek. He answered that he didn't care whether the girl supported him or not. Chaokan Company responded rather quickly, and within an hour, Tianjin Trading Company was notified to suspend their operations for a thorough inspection. Journalists took advantage of this, telling everyone around them that Tianjin was actually run by scammers. Tests showed that the pills contained harmful substances. By showing Ye Wutian's face with his middle finger in close-up, reporters assured that the unconscious young man did not care about the health of ordinary people. As a result, beauty pills were verified as a drug and public opinion was divided. Many were now in favor of closing down the Tianjin Company. It was increasingly common to see people with their phones. Most of them were sitting on forums and arguing fiercely about beauty pills. It was worse when opponents found each other on the street and could not contain their emotions. They would argue until they were white-hot and then get into a fight. Disfigured people who couldn't get beauty pills began picketing the main offices of the health industry in droves and pelting them with eggs and rocks. They shouted that no one dared persecute perfectly honest people. After all, nothing could help them except these pills. The situation was getting more and more heated. Dongcheng's town governor sat at his desk in his office and watched the reports from the scene. He had a lot to think about. Wang Fengxi, a journalist, burst into her father's office and asked why beauty pills were banned. All the media outlets turned against Ye Wuqian, and now there is a riot outside the window. The mayor sighed heavily and lowered his head guiltily. He wiped the sweat from his face and told his daughter that he knew it himself. The girl began belatedly to guess, but she needed to know the truth. And Wang Fengxi begged to be told that the city mayor was not involved. The town governor grinned and said that she had guessed what the matter was, hadn't she? He asked his daughter why she had come to his office. The journalist almost cried in frustration and asked her father why he had done such a cruel thing, since he had recently admired Ye Wutian and his business acumen. The mayor sadly replied that he was forced into it, and now all he can do is blame himself for being on the wrong team at the wrong time. Due to the recent ban and riots, Tianjin Company was deserted. All the computers were turned on, but not a single employee was on site. Chen Kexin sadly told Ye Wutian that only yesterday, the place was still bustling with work, and the corridors were crowded with employees. A young man sat at one of the desks with his hand resting on his cheek. Ye Wutian said that they had already done their best by sending them on paid vacation. The girl almost roared. Chen Kaixin already understood everything, but it was hard for her to accept it. She clenched her fists in anger and revealed that before the ban she had put everything in perfect order, and their company was in compliance with all the strictest requirements. The young man explained that it was all useless. They would constantly interfere and look for a puncture in their organization. Chen Kaixin confusedly asked what he intended to do. Ye Wuqian smirked and said that their Qinshangshan's lifeline was very long and it wasn't easy to cut it off. He stated that it couldn't last long anyway. The young man smiled and said that they would act differently now. They would have to play their role as weak people. Chen Kaixin began to finally understand what he meant, and assumed that Ye Wuqian wanted the people themselves to do everything for him en masse, just like last time. The girl reported that things look different now. Despite the fact that the eastern part of the city is plunged into chaos, the Ministry of Health still does not intend to give up. The young man smiled and said that they just didn't realize who their main enemy was. Not only would they give away the enemy to the public, but they would also give them a strong dose of medicine. Ye Wuqian couldn't help himself and laughed gloatingly. He was happy about his scheme. After all, it was the city's own fault. There was no need to touch his company. The next day, the entire web was buzzing. Tianjin Company hinted that they had been pressured from above, and from that day on, people would have to take care of themselves without their help. At the same time, a certain Ye Wuqian and Chen Kexin, posing as active users, admitted that they allegedly saw Chief Chaokan in Tianjin's office by chance. This news quickly spread and Chaokan Company's website was hacked. Li Qitao was simply furious. The Chaojun Group's stock rapidly began to plummet downward. Soon, a new announcement appeared on the Tianjin website. The company threatened to destroy the entire stock of pills in 3 days because their company had closed down and the expiration date was limited. Yeyuchin was right here too. The news galvanized the public, and soon angry crowds stormed the Ministry of Health and its branches in the city. Dozens of people blocked the entrance to the building. Many people threatened the ministry representatives with death. They were even ready to die themselves if the beauty pills were not returned to them. But they weren't the only ones there. Their opponents came up to the angry crowd and began to assure them that the pills had actually failed the test and that the fake had been created just for the sake of a lot of money. Their argument was getting heated. Each side was ready to prove its case in a fight. The large man in favor of the pills threatened to tear everyone apart with his bare hands. He couldn't stand it any longer and rushed to attack his opponents, dragging all his companions with him. The second man supported him and exclaimed that they would beat the crap out of the enemy. Their opponents were not timid. They did not think of retreating, and also shouted threateningly to their enemies that they were not afraid of them and would deal with them very quickly. Shouting and cursing were heard from all sides. The picketers promised their opponents that they would learn what it was like to be disfigured. After a while, the police arrived. The clash was in full swing and the dust was piling up. The police officers watched the mass brawl with amazement. Captain Zhang Xiaomei took out a megaphone and demanded that the street fight stop immediately. She promised that she would mitigate the punishment if they stopped now. Suddenly, a boulder that came from nowhere hit her in the head, and the girl let go of the megaphone in surprise. Her uniform cap flew to the ground. One of the officers standing nearby timidly remarked that the crowd was ignoring the captain's orders. A huge bump instantly grew on the girl's forehead, and she just went wild. An angry Zhang Xiaomei couldn't get away with it. She pointed at the crowd and ordered to use water cannons and wash away all the hooligans with water. The girl stood back and watched the act of retribution with satisfaction. Several powerful torrents of icy water bound the movements of the crowd, and people shrieked. Not an hour later, the place was empty. The opponents were taken apart, and the fiercest disputants were handcuffed. People began to disperse little by little. The instigator of the fight was being put into a police car. When he turned around, he told Captain Zhang that he had done wrong, but asked to see his disfigured face. The other handcuffed people started yelling that she herself had never been ugly and couldn't understand them. The woman shouted that the people around her were looking at her like a monster. An instigator with a disfigured face said sadly that the advent of pills had given them hope. But the group of people pushing Tianjing would not let them live peacefully. The others shouted that their chance for a normal life had been taken away. Zhang Xiaomei couldn't bear to look at them. After all, she had once been disfigured herself, and knew the value of these pills. Unfortunately, there is absolutely nothing she can do for these poor people right now. A police captain has a duty to maintain law and order. Soon, all police crews returned to the scene. The instigators of the fight were taken to the security bureau and questioned thoroughly. Police Chief Shu couldn't take it anymore and threw a weighty stack of reports on the table. He told Captain Xiaomei that there had been 13 major fights and hundreds of injuries in half a day alone. Shu added that the hooligans hadn't forgotten about Cheokun's company. All of its windows have been broken. Every corner of the company has been pelted with raw eggs, and the smell can be smelled a kilometer away. In addition, the departments of industry and commerce were very badly damaged. Even the Ministry of Health building was pelted with rotten eggs. Shu complained that it was actually worse. Chaokon is pressuring him, and the support of beauty pills, nearly 500,000 people came to Dongcheng. Jiang Xiaomei said thoughtfully that there would be more fights, but now involving foreigners. And if they let them come, it would lead to international disputes. Shu got angry and shouted why she still hadn't called Ye Wutian. After all, if he hadn't told about destroying the pills, all this chaos simply wouldn't have happened. Zhang Xiaomei confusedly said that she had already called him dozens of times, but the young man doesn't pick up the phone. Unfortunately, she can't contact him right now. Shu finally realized that Ye Wutian had done this intentionally, and all they could do was keep order as much as possible, and the rest was up to the top. At this time, Ye Wutian was quietly resting in a luxurious room of a hotel with a beautiful view of the forest. He knew that no one could find him here. Wutian rested his head comfortably on Chen Kaixin's lap and smiled contentedly while lying on the sofa. The girl said in surprise that she hadn't expected such a big mess. Ye Wutian was satisfied with his small protest. He smirked and stated that the strength of the people was unbelievable. This was exactly what he had expected. Chen Kaixin thought warmly of the people and offered to raffle off a certain amount of pills for free as a token of gratitude when this was all over. Suddenly, someone knocked insistently on their room door. Chen Kaixin was surprised to think that no one knew their location. As it turned out, Ouyang Xinyue was standing outside the door. Chen Kaixin asked in surprise why the girl had come to visit them. Xinyue was not much of a talker. She warily looked into her rival's eyes and worriedly said that fake beauty pills had appeared on the market. Ouyang Xinyue entered the room and sat next to the couple on the spacious corner sofa. She happily told everything she had learned from her sources. The girl held out a puffy envelope of documents and explained that it contained all the information about the threats from the Ministry of Health and the Kaoken Company. Ye Wuqian smirked and said that during the sales, the advertisement was banned and now suddenly a fake was appearing. He wondered who might be behind it. Xinyue replied that these pills appeared in Shanghai a few days ago, and they are not called Qingchenshan, but Qinggu. The company calls itself Qinggu Tianjing and has sold 1 million doses. It became apparent that customers were mistaking the pills for a product from the Tianjing group and were therefore buying up the product quickly. Xinyue said sadly that she found out too late and the pills have spread all over the world. Some patients are getting worse. There are even fatal cases. Ye Wuqian instantly decided to issue an official statement that the Tianjing group had nothing to do with Qinggu Tianjing Company's fakes. The young man began to ask the girl where the company was registered and who was its official representative. Ouyang Xinyue thought for a moment and replied that their office was on the island of Guam. They are unlikely to find an official representative. All they know is that he is African. Ye Wuqian said, the small island nation of Guam is a pretty interesting place to register. Looks like they were going to make a fortune and escape. After thinking for a while, the young man got up from the table and said that he should go to Shanghai tonight and personally assess the situation. The girls looked at him with surprise. Both of them actually expressed their desire to keep the young man company at the same time, but in slightly different words. Xinyue realized that they were almost identical and was very surprised. She looked at her rival with undisguised amazement. Chen Kaixin was no less surprised. After all, Ouyang Xinyue was only here as a guest, and she had no business intruding into their personal lives. Xinyue understood the girl's feelings perfectly, and so her eyes immediately drooped and filled with sadness. She knew that Chen would not give up. Chen Kexin also had a lot to think about. She knew that Ouyang Xinyue and Ye Wuqian had crossed paths a lot in the past, and they had a lot to talk about. Chen Kexin felt sad as well. Ye Wuqian solved the matter simply. He said that the girls would both stay in the city and he would take a few of his bodyguard Chen Li's men with him. The events put all the influential people of the city on their ears. The Ning family was no exception. Peng Ning laughed that he liked this youngster more and more. He sat across from his son and said that Ye Wuqian used a great tactic of playing a weak person to gain sympathy and play on people's emotions. The man stated that the matter had taken a serious turn and it would now be very difficult to restore balance. Ye Wuqian may not be able to withstand the battle with the city. The old man replied that he could only blame the young man for choosing the wrong team. Now the fight for the pills had gone very far, and it could not go on much longer. The man told his father that he had gotten news about counterfeit pills called Qinggu. Since Xinyue has her own network, she had to tell Ye Wuqian about it. Ning Peng laughed and said that this was all just for Qinggu pills. The man anxiously asked if they needed to do something about it. The old man asked his son to recall Shiki. Since Ye Wuqian will be going to Shanghai, Peng would like his granddaughter to keep him company. That way, everyone would see their family's attitude towards the case. The man exclaimed that Shiki actually has a fiancé. Recently, the Chen family has some difficulties, and this marriage would help avoid problems. Ning Peng smiled and replied to his son that he was exaggerating too much. After all, his heart was not in the right place, and the final decision would still be made by Shiki herself. A few hours later, the private jet landed at an airport in Shanghai. Evening was coming, and the sun's rays illuminated its shiny wings. The airfield buildings were almost entirely constructed of glass. Despite the popularity of the airport, today the terminal was almost empty. This was due to the outflow of people to Dongcheng. Ye Wuqian went up the escalator with Chen Li and another bodyguard. When leaving the airport, he suddenly saw Shiki beside him and was surprised that the girl was also here. To all his queries, the girl in the short skirt and sleeveless blouse replied that their meeting was accidental. It was just a coincidence. The young man smirked and assumed that Sitsi missed him a lot and started to describe how handsome he was. The embarrassed Sitsi didn't know what to do. She was pounding with anger. A bodyguard whispered to Chen Li that their boss was quite brave. One of his co-workers had once made a love confession to Shiki, and then stayed in bed for a month. Suddenly, a girl appeared in front of them and said that Ye Wuqian took too long to get to Shanghai and made her wait. The young man and Shiki were dumbfounded and froze in place. They were surprised. It was the girl they knew well, Situ Wei. She stood in a beautiful blue dress and straw hat, smiling slyly at the young man. Ye Wuqian couldn't understand what Situ Wei was forgetting here. The bodyguards were also looking at the girl with surprise. She coquettishly folded her hands behind her back and winked at the young man. Situ Wei hugged his elbow with both hands and said that they had to go. Ye Wuqian surprisingly assumed that the girl was supposed to investigate here. He wondered if Wei had bugged him. The girl smiled and told him that the investigation was more dangerous than he could imagine. Siki frowned. She realized that Grandpa had asked her to fly to Shanghai for a reason. It wasn't just the Ouyang family behind the young man. The Situ family was also the guardian of the young man. The young people got into their cars. As soon as the traffic light turned green, Wei pressed the gas pedal to the floor, and the silver SUV sped off. Ye Wuqian and Shiqining were also in the car. Situ Wei handed the young man a map and suggested that he see exactly where they were going. With barely a glance at the map, Wutian realized that this was Qingguo Tianjing's address. He was surprised that the itinerary was drawn up before he even started checking them out. Wei was glad that she managed to surprise the young man. The girl smiled and said she was amazing. Wutian realized that Wei wasn't just doing everything for him. After reaching an industrial area of Shanghai, both cars stopped. Everyone got out of the vehicles and began to look around. There was no limit to their surprise. It was too dirty and cramped to organize the production and storage of medicines, let alone delivery. Ye Wutian looked at the scattered garbage on the floor. Broken glass was all around. He couldn't believe that this was the Qingguo Tianjing company. He asked if Wei was sure this was the right place. It turned out that the girl had thought she was mistaken at first too, but Qingguo's office was really here. Ye Wutian was angry and was ready to trash their office. After all, this phony Qingguo company with their fakes was just an insult to his Qinchengshan beauty pills. The angry young man walked into the office and politely inquired, barely restraining himself, if Qingguo Tianjing Company's office was really here. Both employees were too busy and didn't hear him. They were sitting across from each other and playing online games. Empty bottles and cigarette butts were lying on the table. Ye Wuqian turned black. There aren't many people in this kind of company, and they are also playing at work. The young man raised his tone and asked them to stop playing. He had come to them on business. Without even turning to him, one of them nonchalantly said there were order forms on the table. He would receive the goods within 3 days, if he remembered to pay for the delivery. Situ Wei walked over to the table and thundered with her fist with all her might, drawing attention to herself. She too was fed up with these arrogant young men. Leaning lower on the table, the girl informed them that they actually had a large order and were here to talk business. When they saw the seductive breasts in her cleavage, both employees were immediately stunned. The young man even took off his headphones. He was no longer interested in the game. He immediately said that the guests could sit down on the couch. The young man asked how many pills they needed. Wei smiled and said they needed a lot and they wanted to see the boss. The young man smiled and said that the boss is never here. They have a branch office. The second employee assured that they would organize the delivery of pills in any quantity. Ye Wutian smirked and said that he needed 1 million pills. His eyes burned with sly lights. The young man knew that this would take them by surprise. The businessmen quickly calculated their profits in their minds. At a price of 100,000 per pill, they could make an astronomical sum for 1 million pills. The second staff member looked at Ye Wutian suspiciously. This guy seemed very familiar to him, but the young man couldn't remember where he knew him from. Wei, meanwhile, charmed the first officer and said he could hardly make a decision on such a party on his own, and asked him to contact someone higher up. The young man turned pale and exclaimed that they could do the paperwork themselves. They didn't need a boss. The second employee said that they should either buy the goods or get out of the office. Situ Wei turned to Ye Wuqian and winked at him. The girl smiled and assumed that someone was asking for a little bit of a beating. He was itching to teach the arrogant young man a lesson and show that no one had the right to stand in his way. He grinned and winked at Situ Wei. They didn't even have to intervene. The bodyguards observing nearby shouted with one voice that they understood their master's order. Chen Li and his partner moved toward the insolent men. The noise and rumbling shook the building for a long time. The hapless businessmen screamed so loudly that they scared all the birds on the roof, and they flew away in different directions. Qingguo's staff with bumps on their heads lay on the floor and groaned, making excuses that they were only staff and were not hiding anything. The second asked why the young man was beating them. Yuthian smirked and took a seat beside him. He reminded the young man that he himself had recently recognized his face as familiar, and now he might recognize his guest. Only now did the young man realize what a meat grinder they had gotten themselves into. A smirking young man was reflected in his eyes. The young man cried out in horror that it was Ye Wutian himself. Ye Wutian immediately ran up to the negligent employee and grabbed him by the scruff of the neck. He shouted that no one dared to sell beauty pills that were fake. The other 4 of Ye Wuqian's company watched as he beat up the young man. Even they were uncomfortable with the sight, but the boys had asked for it. They started making excuses that they themselves did not know who was behind it. They were contacted each time from a different number, which was then unavailable. Ye Wuqian stepped on one of the guy's head and pressed his mouth to the floor. He demanded to be told immediately where the warehouse of their products was located. The second young man hastily declared that they would do whatever he said, and said he would escort them to the medicine storage place right away. They walked down a long corridor, and the young man swung open the large double doors leading into the production room. The young man assured me that the warehouse was right here. The other kid stood next to him and trembled with fear. Ye Wutian hummed and walked closer. They found themselves inside a large hangar crammed 3 stories high with racks of products. Sitsi quickly estimated that there were at least 1 million fake pills in that area. Situe was amazed that such a large number of pills were produced in a small period of time. Considering that this was only one of many departments, their opponent acted quickly. Chen Li said that it would be a big disaster if all these fakes were to go on sale, and asked the chief what his orders would be. Ye Wutian frowned at the warehouse. At the same second, he shouted that the whole place, along with the pills, should be set on fire. The young man was angry, his eyes flashing like lightning. One of the guys got down on his knees and begged me not to do it. He said his life was not worth that kind of money, and he would obviously be killed if the pills were burned. Wuqian grabbed him by the scruff of the neck and lifted him off the floor, shouting if he knew what would happen if 1 million pills hit the shelves. The young man told him that many people had died because of counterfeits. Now the 2 young men were tearfully begging not to burn the warehouse with their products and to spare their lives. They knew that the reprisals would be brutal. Ye Wutian thought seriously. He saw that the 2 young men were scared to death and they were really of no use. After all, they were just pawns. He decided to do it his way and use magic. The young man looked glumly at the businessmen and offered to start all over again, suddenly scattering white powder in front of their faces. The magic powder worked instantly, and both employees fell to the floor and passed out for a while. Ye Wutian left the warehouse, remembering to tell Chen Li that the warehouse should accidentally catch fire in half an hour. The bodyguards reported their readiness to carry out the commander's order. They had to get as far away as possible in half an hour. So the silver SUV and the green security jeep raced through the city at top speed. They calculated everything correctly, and at one of the traffic lights, Ye Wuqian saw in his rearview mirror a huge glow from behind, which was growing larger by the second. He spared those 2 useless slugs, and they were thrown away from their branch in the middle of the road. When they regained consciousness, their warehouse was already on fire. After the powder, they had completely lost their memory, and none of the former employees could remember either their own or their partner's name. They couldn't even recognize where they were. Ye Wuqian was thoughtfully silent, and Situe asked him why he wasn't happy after all this. The girl assumed that Ye Wutian was still dissatisfied with the result. Without turning to look at her, Wutian admitted what was bothering him. Their main enemy had yet to be discovered, so there was nothing to rejoice about here. Sitsi said it was difficult to find him because the office was registered in an island nation, and they had only seen a front organization, and therefore would not be able to prove anything. Situe suddenly stopped the silver SUV and pulled to the side of the road. Ye Wutian turned around in surprise and asked why they had stopped. Situe, instead of answering, playfully lifted his chin with her finger and said that there were some very good hot spring baths nearby. The girl asked if he wanted to rest. Ye Wutian smirked and said that it was a very good idea. He suggested Chikining to keep her company. The girl immediately turned purple. She thought that Wutian was suggesting that they go together. The young man immediately started making excuses, saying that she had misunderstood him and that there was nothing to stare at. Cizi got out of the car and exclaimed that she didn't believe a word he said. If he wants to go there so badly, he can go there. But without her involvement, she gave one last shout to Situe that she needed to be constantly on guard, lest that dork eat her whole. Wei smiled when she saw that the girl was angry. She winked at Sitsi and said that she didn't mind being eaten herself. She winked at him and said that she wouldn't mind being eaten. Situe smiled and put her hand on the young man's leg. She said that she would like to visit the spring with him, but she didn't bring her swimsuit with her and asked him to help her pick a new one. Ye Wutian became embarrassed, and a gambling light appeared in his eyes. The young man said that Wei had come to the right place. After all, he was a professional swimsuit picker. Chen Li stopped his jeep and the bodyguards ran up to the silver SUV. Chen Li asked why they had stopped and assumed that his boss was tired and wanted to rest. Ye Wutian turned to the man and informed him that he had some urgent business to attend to. Therefore, they could be completely free until tomorrow. A gorgeous lady in a blue dress and straw hat attracted everyone's attention, and all the young men turned to look at her, despite the presence of their girlfriends. The bachelors looked at Ye Wutian with envy. Each of them thought that the young man didn't deserve to be around such a beautiful girl, and he himself was much better. Situe liked being the center of attention, and she closed her eyes in pleasure as she held onto the young man's hand. The pale Ye Wutian led the girl to the right department. The young man suddenly asked Situe if she was going to seduce him and asked her to answer him honestly. This question caught the girl off guard, and she clapped her eyes in surprise. In fact, Situe had never even thought of such a thing. She let go of his hand at once, and for some time they walked side by side in silence. Ye-Uchian spoiled her cheerful mood with his ridiculous question. The girl reflected that she was just used to being around this guy. She didn't hold hands with anyone or pretend like they were a couple. Situe looked at the young man seriously and asked sternly if Ye-Uchian really felt that way. She was no longer smiling, and all the warmth was gone from her voice in a flash. Now the young man was also puzzled by the change in her face. He noticed that Situe had become too serious, and it was not like her at all. Ye-Uchian thought that he would answer positively if someone asked him if he had any feelings for Situe. After all, no one would be able to resist her. The young man looked at his companion's frowning face and decided that in any case, it was hard for her to control her emotions. Otherwise, she wouldn't have asked such a question. Situe caught the young man's gaze and immediately turned to him. She stared intently into Wutian's eyes and repeated the question of whether the young man really thought she was a seductress. Ye-Wutian realized that this conversation had gone too far and grabbed Wei's hand, reminding her that they were going to pick out a swimsuit. The young man assured that he had a good eye. They walked over to one of the racks of women's clothes, and Ye-Wutian took the shoulder pads with the clothes. He asked Situe to try on a swimsuit. The fabric wasn't bad, and it should be comfortable. The girl immediately blushed and pointed her finger at the shoulder pads. Situe asked if the young man really wanted her to try on this particular swimsuit. Ye-Wutian looked at the shoulder pads. It was a black bikini swimsuit, and the young man blushed, because he hadn't thought of taking this particular model. Out of embarrassment, the young man began to muddle his words and said that they could exchange it for a decent swimsuit, although what he really meant was a sports-type swimsuit. The assistant smiled and said that this swimsuit was a limited edition, and his girl would look just perfect in it. This line magically worked on Situe, and she instantly took the shoulders of the swimsuit, saying that she would try it on. No one could see her blushing face now, and Wei smiled wistfully. Now she was being called someone's girlfriend for the first time in her life. In the fitting room, Wei wondered if she was really acting weird, but then quickly pulled herself together and decided that she needed to calm down first. The girl slid open the fitting room door. The rustling of clothes and Situe's sniffling sounded behind the screen for a while. Finally, the embarrassed girl popped out of the fitting room in her new clothes and asked the young man, winking slyly, if the swimsuit suited her. This swimsuit hid almost nothing, and the flustered Ye-Wutian couldn't answer the girl. His nose bleeding immediately opened up. The young man only raised his thumb up. Situe's good mood returned to her, and she pressed herself against the young man, asking if he would buy that swimsuit. Yes, she knows it's expensive, but she would like him to buy it. Seeing the breasts in front of him, barely covered by the black swimsuit top, the young man smiled and told the girl that she was a great help and could afford anything regardless of its cost. They wandered around the city for the rest of the day and did some shopping, only reaching a Shanghai hotel with a hot spring by evening. Ye-Wutian sat in the hot tub and cursed himself for acting like a gentleman. As a result, Situe didn't even speak to him, and the young man had to rent 2 rooms and sit alone. Suddenly, an interesting thought occurred to him. The fact that he had rented 2 rooms didn't change the fact that Situe could break into his room safely, and he just had to wait. The young man vindictively thought that he had made Wei blush all day today, and when she comes over, Ye-Wutian will just have to tease her. Another 20 minutes passed. It seemed that Situe wasn't going to come to him, and the spring was incredibly hot. Therefore, Ye-Wutian decided to leave, especially since the young man himself couldn't understand why he was even sitting there and acting like a little boy. At that very moment, the door leading from his suite to the hot tub slowly began to pull away. The young man was looking the other way and didn't notice it at first. When the door opened halfway, the seductive silhouette of Situe in her new black swimsuit appeared on the threshold. The girl peeked inside surreptitiously. The young man was tired of exposing himself to excessive heat, and he slowly stood up with his eyes closed, complaining that this heat would surely kill him. Suddenly, someone put tenacious fingers on his shoulder, and Ye-Wutian immediately realized that the girl still couldn't stand it, and came to his room. Situe pressed herself against him and whispered in his ear in a languid voice, wondering if he had decided to leave so early. Ye-Wutian blushed even more. She was just making him blush with her behavior. Feeling the girl's touch on him, Ye-Wutian protested that it was just her imagination, because he was a man and could endure any heat. The young man was glad that Situe had come to him after all. Ye-Wutian turned around and saw a girl standing right in front of him. The young man asked what Situe needed in his room. The girl smirked and noticed that he rarely bought her swimsuits, so she decided to come over and show him off. Situ knelt down and pressed her chest against the young man's shoulder and asked him if her swimsuit fit well. The boy replied that he had seen it in the store, but it looked even better on her. Wei slyly showed him her tongue and pretended to pull on her swimsuit top. The girl asked him if he wanted to see what she had hidden under her swimsuit. Ye Wutian blushed. He realized that the girl had decided to go all the way. After all, Situ Wei was always straightforward and said exactly what she was going to do. Struggling to contain himself, the young man pulled away and said that Wei shouldn't trust his self-control so much. He's afraid he might do something unnecessary. The girl snorted contemptuously and pretended to leave, saying that Wutian could continue to dream that she would give herself to him so easily tonight. Situ Wei immediately lowered herself into the spring, following the young man's example. She said that there was a very strong current of water, and she felt a little unsteady. Wutian was very surprised by the girl's words. He didn't understand what Situ Wei meant, because there simply couldn't be any flow in closed hot springs. At the same moment, a black object appeared before his eyes, and the young man looked at it perplexed. He moved closer to see what it was. Taking it in his hands, the young man suddenly realized that it was the top from Situ Wei's swimsuit, and the mere thought of it drove him into a blush. It was hard for him to be here. The young man turned around to Situ Wei. He wanted to ask if she had really taken off her swimsuit. The girl looked down in embarrassment and explained that the swimsuit top had been swept away by the current. Situ Wei blushed and asked the young man to come over and cover her. If anyone saw her like that, she would never be able to marry again. Ye Wutian said he would help her, but he couldn't get the thought out of his head why Wei was even doing this, since it was already clear that no strangers could be here. Ye Wutian stepped a couple of steps towards the girl, and suddenly, another black-colored object floated on the surface of the spring. The young man looked at it incredulously, already knowing what it was. His hunch was confirmed. It was a swimsuit bottom. Apparently, Situ Wei wanted him to bleed to death from a nosebleed here in the first place. Meanwhile, the girl winked at him and bashfully told him that the current had been very strong and absolutely all her clothes had been washed away. The young man walked over to the girl and took her by the shoulders. Situ Wei covered her breasts with her hands. Wutian said, trying his best to suppress his desire so as not to embarrass her. Wei blushed and told him that he didn't have to restrain his desires. Her eyes showed passion, and Wutian didn't know how to escape it. He let go of the girl's shoulders and exclaimed that Situ Wei had asked for it. Their faces were now very close together, and the young man was finding it increasingly difficult to control himself. The young man looked at Situ Wei carefully and asked if she would regret her rash act later. The girl's face had changed a little. She was no longer as cheerful as she had been a moment ago. She looked at him seriously, as if she wanted to say something to him but couldn't. Ye Wutian took another step. Their mouths were so close to each other that they were ready to merge into one. The young man realized that the girl was no longer playing with him but showing her true feelings. A confused Situ Wei forced herself away from the young man and quietly asked him if he could take care of her since she wanted to be his first wife. This question took him by surprise, for he had never thought of Situ Wei as a consort. He had never thought of Situ Wei as a consort nor of marriage in general, for he could not afford it as emperor. The embarrassed Situ Wei never gave herself a kiss. She quietly asked the young man if he could take care of her since she wanted to be his first wife. Ye Wutian looked at her with undisguised surprise. Not long ago, Situ Wei had only teased him as much as she could, but now she was already going to marry him. Shamefully covering her breasts with her hand, the girl asked if he couldn't take care of her, and said she was ready for him. Ye Wutian turned away, and replied that he wasn't ready yet. Overcome with resentment, Wei said that she is even willing to take the place of the second wife. Of course, she realizes that he has Chen Kaishan in first place. Ye Wutian replied that it wasn't about whether she was first or second at all, just that he wasn't in control of himself and might do something not quite appropriate. A confused Situ Wei pretended not to understand the young man and playfully asked, closing her eyes, what he would do to her. Ye Wutian was fed up with this and rose to his full height, as he couldn't guarantee that he could continue to restrain himself if he stayed here. The young man realized that he had to be careful with Situ's family, so he had to leave soon. He said goodbye to the girl and told her he was leaving. Otherwise, he would not be responsible for his actions. Situ Wei followed the young man's back with her eyes and warmly thought that she was becoming more and more confused because of him. The girl shouted back that they meet often anyway, and she wasn't worried. Wei said he didn't have to pretend. The young man just had to turn around. Ye Wutian thought that he would definitely be able to restrain himself from afar, especially since this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The anticipation made him drool. Extremely pleased with the offer, the young man began to slowly turn his head, reminding Situ Wei that she herself had asked to look at her without her swimsuit. Suddenly, the young man's smile waned. He simply couldn't believe his eyes. Situ Wei had outsmarted him again. He looked at the girl with astonishment. Situ Wei stood at full height and smiled dazzlingly. It appeared that her charms were hidden by another swimsuit. She assumed that wasn't what the young man wanted to see. Of course, Ye Wutian wasn't happy after all. He had been teased all evening and was so screwed over. He shouted that her swimsuit had been swept away by the current, and there were these stripes. Situ Wei calmly informed him that she should surprise him a little, but it was actually possible to put on 2 swimsuits as well. There was nothing strange about it. She had the last word. When she had achieved her goal, Situ Wei proudly said that she was no longer playing with him and left. The bewildered young man remained standing by the spring. Situ Wei defiantly slammed the door so hard that its glass shook and the door almost slid off its rails. Ye Wutian scratched his head in puzzlement. The young man stood in his swimming trunks and absent-mindedly looked at the door behind which Situ Wei had disappeared. He couldn't believe that he had spent so much time in the spring exhausting himself for nothing. The young man's patience was wearing thin, and he shouted at the top of his voice that the devilish Situ Wei had fooled him once again. Ye Wutian was angry at himself for giving in to her. Meanwhile, the girl closed the door of his room behind her and stood pensively in the corridor near the door. She wanted to understand the boy's true feelings for her, and today, she had really almost played around. When she remembered that Ye Wutian had almost kissed her, she was embarrassed again, and absent-mindedly thought about the further development of events. Ye Wutian went back to his room and got dressed. He sat on the comfortable double bed with his phone in his hands, habitually thinking of reading the latest news before going to bed. To his surprise, there were many unanswered calls on his phone. All of them were either from Ouyang Xinyue or Chen Kaixin, and the young man didn't understand what could have happened in 24 hours. Without thinking long, Ye Wutian immediately called Chen Kaixin, and worriedly asked what had happened in Dongcheng that was so important that he was constantly getting calls. The girl excitedly replied that fake pills have spread virtually all over the country, and more people are suffering because of it. Ye Wutian thought this was simply unbelievable, and he exclaimed that he had just recently burned one of their warehouses to the ground. They couldn't set up production again so quickly. Kexin's voice was frightened. She said that Qingguo Tianjing owned many outlets, and Shanghai appeared to be the location of their small warehouse of products. Ye Wutian realized that everything had gone wrong and angrily squeezed the sheet so hard that his fingertips turned white. He notified Chen Kaixin that he was leaving right away. The residence of a rich young man with his shirt open. He sits on a couch, placing his foot on his slave's back. A second girl stands beside him. She has a bottle of wine and a glass on a tray. Taking a sip of wine, the young man told the slave in bandages and plasters that he had to spend a lot of money to get her back on her feet. He didn't feel sorry for her treatment, though. The young man laughed and told himself that thanks to Ye Wutian's pills, he was able to earn as much as 8 million in just 2 days, and it was worth the effort. His eyes were burning madly. The young man was simply obsessed with the lust for profit. He exclaimed that this was just the beginning, and he needed a lot more money. He had to break away from his far-reaching plans. Suddenly, the telephone rang, and the young man turned his head in displeasure. He picked up the phone and immediately turned white when he saw that his grandfather was calling him. It was not good. The patriarch called him very rarely, and usually not to say warm words. The young man pressed the green button and shyly said hello to his grandfather. The young man's pride was gone, and now he was like an obedient lapdog himself. The patriarch wasn't saying much. He was only interested in whether his grandson was involved in the creation of Qingcheng pills. The young man realized that his grandfather was asking for a reason, and now he was finished. Trying to bring credibility and firmness to his voice, the flustered young man began to justify that he would never do that. The patriarch replied that he is absolutely not concerned about the amount of money his grandson has earned. He just demands that the production of the pills be stopped immediately. The angry caller hung up, and the bewildered young man heard only a long beep. He thought excitedly of his grandfather's demand that he give it all up. The young man was frightened, but he wasn't going to give up so easily, because he had made almost 10 million on this. The young man clutched the phone he held in his hand in anger, and its screen began to crack and shatter. On the other hand, the young man realized that his grandfather was under pressure from above, and he really should obey. These contradictions were driving the young man crazy. After arriving home, Ye Wutian first investigated the sales channels of fake pills and mobilized the media, urging customers to be careful. Ouyang Xinyue tapped her channels and informed Ye Wutian and Chen Kaixin that Tianjing Company might reopen soon. The government took timely action. On that day, the fraud associated with fake beauty pills was being discussed across the country. Even on the radio, there were calls to reject counterfeit pills. Large TV screens across the city showed a short report on counterfeit pills. The anchorwoman said that it only made patients worse. At the end of the program, the presenter exclaimed that this was absolutely unacceptable. Thus began a campaign to confiscate and destroy counterfeit drugs. Jiang Xiaomei happily participated in catching those involved, who would definitely be punished. In just 1 week, all the production and distribution points were sealed and destroyed. Of course, Ye Wutian knew very well that he was only able to win this war because of Ouyang Xinyue's support. So he had come to express his recognition and look at the old man at the same time. They were walking through the small park inside the manor, and Xinyue congratulated the young man on his victory. He replied that it was good news for her too, since she had their shares. Wutian said that more and more applicants were coming to them, and it was time to think about expansion. The girl asked how much he wanted to invest, and what scale of production. The young man said that they would like to build a 30-story building and they have budgeted more than 10 million. Wutian said that he had sketches of the design. The girl smiled and promised to use the most appropriate materials for their building. She assured the young man that everything would be at its best. Xinyue took the opportunity to remind her that it was today that Ouyang Anan should be on his feet, according to the young man. Ouyang said there shouldn't be a problem. He was being looked after. At the entrance of the house, they met Ouyang Xianyu. He immediately shouted that Wutian had no business being here and loudly called the guards to have the young man thrown out of the mansion. Ye Wutian smirked and said that Elder Ouyang was about to wake up, and some individuals had already lost control of themselves because of this. The girl stepped forward and told her brother that Ye Wutian was her personal guest, and he had no right to keep him out of the house or call for guards without her knowledge. Ouyang Xianyu smiled understandingly and asked what this guest meant to her. He wryly suggested that Xinyue and Wutian were close friends, possibly lovers as well. He shouted that Xinyue has nothing to be proud of. She sold out for 10% of the shares, and if her sister wanted to go out on a date, she should find somewhere else to do it. The girl slapped his cheek resoundingly. Xianyu grabbed the swollen spot in surprise. Xinyue promised to deal with Xianyu if he didn't shut up and stop talking nonsense. Xianyu was angry and screamed at Xinyue, saying that she was annoying him and he would deal with her now. The young man raised his fist and was ready to strike hard. Suddenly he was stopped by a strong kick to his stomach. Ye Wutian was ahead of the young man and stamped the sole of his shoe into his blue t-shirt. Xianyu cried out in pain and pressed his hand to his stomach. Ye Wutian told the young man that the Ouyang family was only afloat because of Xinyue's efforts, and he dared to raise his hand against her. Xianyu's face twisted with anger and pain, and he demanded in tears that the boy and girl both leave the Ouyang family home. At this time, Ouyang Hao came up to them and asked in surprise what was going on here. Crouching in pain, Xianyu was glad that he could take revenge on both of them. Ye Wutian said that his brother insulted Xinyue and tried to hit her. He thinks that Hao doesn't necessarily have to stand up for his negligent brother in this case. Hao turned to his brother and asked if it was true. Xiangyu began to sling mud at them and shouted that Hao should throw them out of Ouyang's house immediately. Ouyang Hao's reaction followed immediately. Xianyu himself confirmed Ye Wutian's words and had to be punished. Hao slapped his brother on the other cheek with all his might. Humiliated in front of everyone, Xianyu grudgingly clutched his cheek and asked Hao in surprise why he did this. After all, there was no way he was supporting Xinyue and her guest. Hao admonished his brother that he should never allow himself to treat his sister like that, no matter what happened. Ouyang Hao turned to Wutian and informed him that that slap was meant for him personally. In any case, Xianyu belonged to the Ouyang family, and Ye Wutian had no right to touch him. The young man smirked and asked what would happen if he hit Xianyu. He said that Hao could try to hit him, but in doing so, the two brothers would become his blood enemies. Ouyang Hao struggled to restrain himself. He knew Ye Wutian much better than his brother, and understood what the young man was capable of, so he silently resented him. Wutian went up to Xiangyu and said that they are making him angry at the wrong time when Anan should be waking up. And the more they make him angry, the less willing he is to help the Ouyang family. With a smirk, he exclaimed that the scheme didn't work and the talented Xianyue had gotten a whipping himself. With those words, he went into the house and called Xinyue with him. Xianyu immediately took out his phone and called his father. He warned Genrin that Ye Wutian had come and was going to his grandfather's house. He failed to stop the intruder. His father replied that he didn't expect Xiangyu to help him, so he asked him to go straight to his grandfather and he would stay by his side. Old Ouyang Anan was lying on his bed with his eyes closed. Wutian crouched beside his bed. The rest of the family was standing in the doorway, watching. The young man thought gratefully of the marvelous Xuan Yuan Qi technique. After manipulating the patient, he said that Anan should regain consciousness no later than tonight. Xinyue and her father were very grateful. The man laughed and said that it was exactly what they all expected to hear from the wonderful doctor. The brothers were not so pleased. Xianyu turned pale and remarked that the young man had excellent skills in medicine. Ouyang Hao tried to smile and exclaimed that this was great news. Ye Wutian noticed this tension and said that they didn't have to play along. He already understands that the news of the old man's recovery is not equally pleasant for everyone. Suddenly, someone behind him placed a hand on his shoulder. Ye Wutian was surprised by this familiarity and immediately turned around. As it turned out, it was Genren. Smiling awkwardly, he tried to convince the young man that he was mistaken. The news of the old man's recovery is equally happy for the entire Ouyang family. Ye Wutian couldn't understand what the catch was. He realized that the temporary father of the Ouyang Genren family would be at a loss if Ouyang Anan couldn't wake up. On the other hand, Genren was smiling so naturally that it could very well come off as the truth. Wutian was sure that they were up to something, but he couldn't figure out what it was. The young man was sure that he had done everything right, and the old man should wake up by evening no matter what. His physical condition was normal, and there was no need to worry about that. Genren seemed to sense the young man's doubt in his sincerity, and asked Xinyue to escort Dr. Ye out. He should rest. They would look after the old man themselves. Ouyang Xinyue and the young man went for a walk along the alleys of the vast estate. There were several comfortable benches near a large fountain, and Xinyue chose one of them. They sat side by side on a bench, and the embarrassed Ouyang Xinyue was very grateful to the young man for curing her grandfather. She warmly thanked Ye Wutian for his work. This did not seem enough to the young man, and he stopped the girl and said that she should really look at the situation, because in this case, gratitude alone would not be enough. The girl was surprised and asked, turning to the young man, what price he considered acceptable. Wutian was waiting for that, and he closed his eyes dreamily, as if thinking. The young man suddenly pointed his index finger at the girl and declared that he liked pretty girls. Xinyue was stunned. This was too much. The girl angrily assumed that Ye Wutian had decided to force her to give herself away in such a way. A little more, and she would have gotten angry and left no matter what. Ye Wutian realized this, and squealed that he was just joking. The young man was simply amazed that Xinyue was taking everything seriously. Situue was easier to deal with in this regard. Xinyue turned away, and quietly said that she didn't like such jokes. Ye Wutian asked her to forget this conversation, and suggested waiting for news about Anan for the time being. The girl bowed her head and sighed heavily. She was very worried about her grandfather, and here was the object of her affection with his jokes. She knew she couldn't take Kexen's place. The day passed quickly, and evening came. The windows in Ouyang's house began to light up one by one. Everyone was eagerly awaiting the appearance of the Ouyang family elder. Ouyang Xinyue was tired of everything and fell asleep on the young man's shoulder. Ye Wutian couldn't fight sleep for long either and dozed off, reclining comfortably on the back of the bench. Suddenly, the girl's phone rang and woke them both up. She immediately grabbed the phone, hoping it was Anan's father and grandfather who had finally woken up. Ye Wutian opened his eyes, trying to figure out where he was, and realized that he and Xinyue were still in Ouyang Manor. Ouyang Xinyue answered the phone call, rubbing her sleepy eyes in passing. She asked what the situation was at the moment. The young man realized that the conversation was about the patriarch. Suddenly, the girl squealed into the phone. Tears appeared in her eyes. It turned out that Ouyang Anan still hadn't woken up, contrary to the young man's expectations. Ouyang Xinyue, along with the young man, came to the old man's room. Genren and his sons were standing at his bedside. Ouyang Anan really hadn't woken up yet. His eyes were closed. Ouyang Hao pounced on Xinyu and angrily said that the old man should have woken up by now. After all, it was already nighttime, and he still hadn't woken up yet. Ye Wutian examined Anan carefully. He couldn't understand what was wrong, for old Ouyang should have woken up in the afternoon, and he had spoken of the evening just in case. Xiang Yu said contemptuously that he didn't make a miracle doctor. If the old man didn't wake up in 12 hours, Wutian would be in for an interesting surprise. The young man had no time to argue with this arrogant guy. He had to quickly realize what had gone wrong, for he had calculated everything correctly. Wuqian demanded to leave the room. Xiang Yu smirked and wryly suggested that Wuqian just didn't like it when people spoke the truth about him. Ouyang Xinyue couldn't stand it and demanded to be silent immediately. Xiang Yu immediately fell silent. He remembered both slaps well, so he didn't dare to argue with his sister, thinking that he could deal with the two of them later. Xinyue assumed that the night wasn't over yet, and it was worth checking everything again. Wutian told the girl that he would figure it out for himself and asked to be left alone with the patient. Ouyang Hao demanded to explain to them the reason why the old man was still sleeping since the young man was asking them to come out. Xian Yu smirked proudly behind his brother's back. Now he felt protected. Ye Wutian raised his head and said that he had nothing to fear. He would have destroyed the old man long ago if he wanted to. And they should go out if they wanted Ouyang Anan to wake up. All four of them left the room, reluctantly obeying the young man's order. Xian Yu glanced at him unhappily and muttered that Ye Wutian was just making himself look important. Ignoring his words, the doctor slammed the door shut, and now no one could see what was going on in there. After closing the door, the young man returned to the old man and looked at him. Old Anan was lying in the same position with his eyes closed, and Ye Wuqian turned away to the spacious window. Without turning around, he told the old man that Anan could pretend no more. The young man knows perfectly well that he has been awake for a long time. Ouyang Anan realized that he had been declassified and opened his eyes. However, it didn't make much difference, because so far no one in Ouyang's family had guessed his true state of health. The old man admitted that he had overheard the conversations in the room and assumed that the young man was the doctor who had saved him. He asked his name, and the young man answered. Ye Wuqian turned his head to the old man and reproached Anan for being selfish on top of everything else. The old man pretended not to understand what he was saying. The young man turned to him and exclaimed that there was no need to pretend in front of him. He had only saved him because of Ouyang Xinyue. But he remembered very well how the old man had humiliated Chen Kaixin at the banquet. Old man Anan looked at the young man and remembered that day. Yes, it was his blunder, and he had thought at the time that the commoner Chen Kaixin was claiming a place in the Ouyang family. The old man sighed heavily and said that he was grateful to the young man for saving him anyway. His pride did not allow him to apologize to the young man for his arrogant act. Ye Wuqian realized this and said that he should thank Xinyue. She put a lot of effort into saving Anan. He's leaving. The young man has no business being here now that the old man is awake. Old Anan sat up on the bed in a flash. He begged not to give away his secret, and asked no one in the Ouyang family to tell anyone that he had come to his senses. Ye Wuqian turned around and said in surprise that he was still testing his loved ones after being in a coma for a long time. The young man recognized in amazement that Anan was indeed a selfish person. Old man Ouyang looked at the young man sternly and politely asked him to choose his words more carefully. Ye Wuqian didn't even turn around. Already at the very door, the young man told the patriarch that he was too lazy to mess around with the Ouyang family anyway, so he could do whatever he wanted. After leaving the room, the young man defiantly slammed the door, leaving the old man alone with his remorse. Xinyue had really gone out of her way to save his grandfather. As soon as Ye Wuqian left the room, the family members waiting outside the door flooded him with questions about what was wrong with the old man and whether he would be all right. The young man walked past them and explained that he had done all he could. Now it was up to old man Anan. He wasn't going to open his eyes for some reason. Genrin asked Wuqian in surprise what he meant and how long it would take for the old man to finally get back on his feet. Without turning around, the young man said he didn't know. It could be a day or the old man's whole life. In any case, he had done his best, and so he bade them farewell. Leaving the mansion, Ye Wuqian sadly thought that a large family was not yet a sign of happiness. Even within it, there could be completely different people. Xinyue and his father were the first to arrive at the patriarch's bedside. The man sighed heavily. He had hoped that his father would wake up earlier. Xinyue fell to her knees in tears and begged her grandfather to wake up. Just then, Genrin appeared in the room. He practically pushed them out of the door, reasoning that it was late, and the old man needed to rest. They could continue tomorrow as well. Genrin smiled kindly at his niece, showing with his entire appearance that he wanted only good for the entire Ouyang family. Once the man realized that Xinyue wasn't looking at him, he turned around and threw a hate-filled glare in his father's direction. Wuqian was right. He didn't need his father's awakening. Several hours passed. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Ye Wuqian's phone rang, and he immediately answered the call. Situue gave him such information that he did not immediately believe it. It turned out that the Ouyang family's suburban estate had burned to the ground. Apparently the hearth of the fire was in old man Anan's room. A fire broke out in the Ouyang family's estate at 2 o'clock in the morning. When the firefighters arrived, the whole place was ablaze. A terrible rumble could be heard everywhere. The fire marshal quickly gave orders. Genrin ran up to the firefighting crew and shouted that they needed to put out the fire faster because their father of the family was still in the house. Ouyang Xinyue tearfully cried out that her grandfather was still there and needed to be saved. Her father could barely hold the girl back and exclaimed that the fire was too strong. She shouldn't risk herself. After a while, the flames were extinguished, but there were still small fires smoldering in a few places. The once rich Ouyang villa was reduced to ashes. Another hour later, a rescue team was searching for survivors. Despite their intensive search, they failed to find any of the victims. When she finally got to her grandfather's room, Xinyue was surprised to see that his empty bed had been burned to the ground, but the old man was clearly not there. Her father stood there and glanced around the room with a frown. A worried Xinyue grabbed the man's hand and asked what could have happened to her grandfather. Her father couldn't answer her, for he was afraid to voice his assumptions. After them, Ouyang Genrin visited the room. He too carefully examined the room. but could not find any trace of the patriarch of the Ouyang family. Xian Yu happily squealed that Wu Tian had set the arson. Hao frowned at his sister. Xin Yue shouted back that this was not his method. He could have killed any of them many times. Xin Yue's father shouted that they should just find out who was behind it. It didn't matter who it was, the villain should get what he deserved anyway. Genren stood back and watched his brother. The man felt his prickly gaze and turned around. The man clenched his teeth in anger and repeated again that he would not let anyone burn down his house. No matter what it took, they would find and punish the perpetrator of the tragedy. Genren looked at him appraisingly and smirked. He said that the man couldn't be suspicious enough to suspect him, his own brother. Walking past Genren, the man blurted out that absolutely the entire Ouyang family was under suspicion, and his brother Genren was no exception. A fire at a famous estate shook up the relatively quiet city of Dongcheng. The pictures of the villa on fire adorned the front pages of all local publications. It wasn't just the police who were pressured by the city's top brass. The mayor himself came to the department and said that Director Shu only had 3 days. Otherwise, it would become a laughingstock for the entire city. Shu turned pale and said that 3 days was too short. After all, there were several million people in the city. He realized that it would be very difficult. The mayor sighed and confided that it wasn't really his own whim. He was being pressured by his superiors and had to confide in Director Shu. Shu didn't hesitate for long. He called Captain Jiang over and ordered her to detain the main suspect in the case. Xiaomei asked why exactly she was the one doing this all the time. Nevertheless, Jiang Xiaomei, accompanied by an officer, went to the young man's residence and brought him to the interrogation room. On the other side of the table sat Director Shu himself and Captain Jiang Xiaomei. Shu recalled that 5 hours before the incident, Ye Wutian had been alone with old man Anan. Jiang Xiaomei sternly said that he was the prime suspect in the case. She asked if he had anything to add and suggested that he had witnesses. The young man tiredly explained that he had said this more than once. He had only visited him as a doctor. The young man resented the fact that he had not even received any money for the treatment and was already in a bind. Director Shu said that they would be happy to believe him, but they needed at least one witness. Otherwise, it would be hard for him to prove the young man's innocence. Unfortunately, the guy had no witnesses at all. That night, Chen Kexin had spent the night at the company and could not confirm his alibi. Ye Wutian realized that he was in a serious trouble because the head of a large family had been kidnapped. If he is not cleared of suspicion, the young man will be in serious trouble. Suddenly, the door to the interrogation room opened, and a ringing female voice said that they were mistaken about the young man having no witnesses. Shu and Xiaomei turned around in surprise. On the threshold of the room stood Situ Wei in a red dress. Smiling, the girl asked how they could have forgotten about her since she was the witness. Jiang Xiaomei was simply discouraged and wailed that Situ Wei had somehow miraculously managed to bypass the guards. After all, they are in the security bureau. Situ Wei smiled and informed the girl that she had entered here in the normal way, and her method did not include going through the little captain. Jiang Xiaomei became angry. She angrily asked Director Shu what was even going on. The police chief turned pale and admitted that there was an order from his superiors to let Sita Wei in. Wei smiled and said that Captain Jiang might hate her, but this was not the time to air personal grievances. Jiang Xiaomei gritted her teeth in anger and asked how Situ Wei was going to testify in Ye Wutian's favor. Situ Wei leisurely walked around the interrogation room and was right behind the young man's back. She placed her fingers on his shoulders so gently that Ye Wutian froze. Situ Wei leaned over and hugged him with her other arm, bringing it down on the young man's chest. She dreamily closed one eye and informed everyone present that they had been together last night. Xiaomei's heart was ready to jump out of her chest. Situ Wei's words that she had spent last night with Ye Wutian simply threw her off balance. The girl looked at her rival with resentment. Ye Wutian turned to Situ Wei in surprise and mentally asked the girl how she could joke with her reputation like that. Situ didn't seem to care at all. She winked at the young man. Captain Jiang Xiaomei was so stunned that she was unable to conduct the interrogation. Without giving up hope, she asked Situ Wei what they had been doing last night. Situ Wei shamefully faded and raised her head. She smiled faintly and replied to Xiaomei that they were doing what they were supposed to do at night. Jiang Xiaomei couldn't take it anymore and yelled at Wutian that he had Chen Kai-shin and was still having affairs with other women. Shu thought that he wouldn't want to be in Wutian's shoes. Ye Wutian mentally tried to insinuate to Xiaomei that he had never met anyone but herself, but couldn't admit it now because he would lose his only witness. Jiang Xiaomei turned purple, but now from embarrassment. Stammering and struggling to choose her words, she asked Wutian if it was really the two of them and Situ Wei who had done it last night. Wei smiled and said that the captain is so innocent. It would be much better if Xiaomei explained what was meant by that, otherwise Situ Wei didn't quite understand her. Jiang Xiaomei blushed and almost cried out in tears that Wei knew what she meant. Wei smiled calmly and replied that she didn't know what she was talking about at all. Situ Wei had managed to piss Xiaomei off, and she was now just yelling that it annoyed her terribly, and she didn't have to explain anything to Situ Wei. The girl smiled as she looked at Xiaomei. The enraged Xiaomei turned to Ye Wutian and demanded to know whether they were doing it or not. The surprised young man remarked that this was actually beyond the scope of a normal interrogation. Jiang Xiaomei was like an enraged tigress. She simply became furious and started yelling at the young man, demanding her to answer whether they had done it last night or not. Ye Wuqian looked away. The last thing he wanted to do right now was to slander Sita Wei, and until the last moment, he had hoped that everything would turn out to be just speculation. Unfortunately, the captain forced him to make a confession. Hearing the positive answer, Xiao Mei's face immediately sank. An undivided sadness appeared on her face. She looked at the young man in surprise. Captain Jiang Xiaomei tried to pretend that she didn't care at all, and laughed contemptuously in the young man's face. Squinting her eyes, she said through gritted teeth that one of them was intemperate and the other overexcited. Uchan mentally begged her to stop and realize that it wasn't really like that. The young man jumped up from his chair and called out to the girl, trying to justify himself. Without turning around, Xiaomei asked her to call her Captain Chen, or better yet, not to defile her ears with her voice. Jiang Xiaomei turned to Situ Wei and asked her as a witness to detail where the two of them had been last night and what they had been doing. The girl smiled contentedly. An hour later, all four of them were standing at the entrance to the Bureau of Investigation. Shu laughed and said that the young man was very lucky with women, but he was not without problems. Director Shu stated that he was clearing him of suspicion. Ye Wutian hoped that they would detain him a little less often. It was not a place where one wanted to appear often. Director Shu replied that it only depended on how he himself could get into trouble less often. He said goodbye and said that he had too much work to do. Jiang Xiaomei abruptly turned around and didn't even say goodbye. She was very angry and intended to go after the principal so she wouldn't see either of them. Situ Wei ordered her to stop. Jiang Xiaomei was surprised that she, a captain, was being ordered to stop right outside her department. Carelessly turning her head, Xiaomei asked what she needed. She didn't want to talk to either Wuqian or this girl. Situ Wei stepped around the girl and grabbed her by her uniform shirt imperiously, pulling her to her side. The captain turned pale. She had not expected such behavior from the girl at all. Situ Wei reminded the captain that this wasn't the first time they had detained Ye Wutian, and it really annoyed her. Now she was no longer smiling, but could really stomp on Xiaomei. The girl explained that she was just doing her job. If Situ Wei thinks she can do it better, she can try. Besides, she's not afraid of Situ Wei's threats. Ye Wutian couldn't stand it and came running to separate them. He said that they had no special reason to hate each other. The rivals stared at each other. The young man hugged Sita Wei and said that she was mad at the wrong person, for he was indeed the prime suspect. Wei continued to stare at her rival. Grabbing the young man's hand, Sita Wei turned around and dragged him towards the car. She said they should go. There was no point in staying here. They got into the red SUV and Situ Wei drove away from the station. Captain Jiang Xiaomei was still standing at the entrance of the Bureau of Investigation, watching them. Her lips were shaking with anger. She knew very well that she didn't care who Ye Wutian was sleeping with, and there was nothing she could do about it. On the other hand, Situ Wei's arrival had ruined everything, and now she was in a very bad mood. Jiang Xiaomei only let herself burst into tears when she was alone. After the terrible fire, the Ouyang family had moved into one of their residences. Ouyang Xinyue sat on her bed in her room and thoughtfully flipped through the city news. The girl's assistant came into the room and said that Situ Wei had been helped out by Ye Wutian, but she had to sacrifice her reputation to act as a witness. Xinyu felt sad. She realized that Situ Wei had nothing with Ye Wutian, but she felt bad that the girl had helped Wutian. Xinyue wished she could be in her shoes. The assistant understood how she felt and informed her that Situ Wei must have a definite purpose. She advised Xinyue to call Wutian herself and talk to him. Xinyue reproached herself that it was too late. It was because of her that Wutian was in trouble. She had been so busy that she hadn't helped him, and now she couldn't even call him. The distressed girl didn't dare to dial Wutian's number and put the phone aside. She told her assistant that they already had a lot of work to do. Meanwhile, the red SUV that Ye Wutian and Situ Wei were in was slowly driving around the city. The girl wanted to stay close to her passenger for a while longer. Situ Wei was not the least bit embarrassed by the recent incident, and she faintly smiled. The girl turned to the young man and said that he was clearly not in the mood. Ye Wutian kept looking out his side window. He was ashamed to admit that he had to sacrifice a girl's reputation just to get the charges against him dropped. Situ Wei had no problem guessing that he was only helping the Ouyang family because of Xinyu. She didn't even call him when he was in trouble, even though she was aware that the young man had been arrested. Wei continued to press the sore spot and stated that Ye Wutian must be feeling lonely and abandoned right now. Ye Wutian was surprised at how quickly Situ Wei understood everything. That was the way it was. Ouyang Xinyue had never called him once. Naturally, this couldn't help but disappoint him. While the young man was thinking about all of this, Situ Wei suddenly stopped the red SUV and looked at the young man expressively while unbuckling his seatbelt. She instantly climbed onto Wutian's lap and asked him not to think about Xinyue. After all, for the sake of helping her friend, Situ Wei had even forgotten about her good name, and that was worth a lot. Ye Wutian calmly looked at the girl and asked if Wei had come as a representative of the Situ family or purely of her own free will. Situ Wei affectionately placed her hand on his chest and said that there was no difference. Ye Wutian replied that he could only accept her personal help. Wei closed her eyes and said that he was a real fool and didn't show any weakness at all. If anything, there were a lot of suspicious things about the fire, and she wanted to know something. Situ Wei suddenly opened her eyes and asked the young man if he had managed to wake up old man Ouyang. Her face now looked very interested. Ye Wutian replied that he would not comment on the situation. He quickly moved on to another topic and recalled that Wei had risked her reputation and asked for a reason. The young man took Situ Wei's hands and asked again if the girl had come to his rescue by herself or at the behest of Situ's family. Wei instantly blushed. She realized that she was losing the initiative. She usually played with the young man, but now he was making her blush. Situ Wei closed her eyes and wondered what would happen if she admitted to the young man that she had come to his aid purely of her own volition. Ye Wuqian instantly pulled Situ Wei towards him, and their lips came together in a long-awaited kiss. The girl opened her eyes wide in surprise. She had not expected this. The young man made her blush very much because before Situ Wei had only allowed herself to play with him. But now he had made her hesitant desires come true. Rejoicing at his spectacular prank, Ye Wuqian immediately jumped out of the car. The young man laughed and thanked Situ Wei for the favor. The girl fell into the driver's seat. The embarrassed Situ Wei looked at the young man with mixed feelings and followed his back with a warm gaze. He really managed to surprise the girl. Embarrassed and a little angry, Situ Wei exclaimed that the little lecher had actually decided to lay his hands on his big sister. Walking into the Tianjing beauty office, Ye Wutian whistled a song cheerfully, realizing that the roles had finally switched. He said hello to the receptionist, thinking that Situ clearly didn't expect this. All around, female employees greeted him, and the young man thought that the more orders he got, the more beautiful girls would surround him. It was time to expand the company. Ye Wuqian turned on the laptop at his workplace and quickly saw that land in Dongcheng City cost a lot of money. But after all, the large availability of beautiful women was worth it. The young man dreamily closed his eyes and exclaimed that to begin with he would set himself a small goal. All the beauties of the city should work for him. By uniting all the beauties of the city, he would conquer the whole country and then the whole world. The young man remembered all the beauties he knew and exclaimed that it would be really very cool. Chen Kexin walked into the office and perplexedly asked what exactly he thought was cool. Rejoicing that she hadn't heard anything, the young man replied that he was looking into the future of pills. Ye Wuqian noticed that Chen Kaixin was in high spirits and inquired about what such a good thing had happened. The girl was indeed overjoyed. Chen Kexin smiled dazzlingly and said that a huge amount of money had been transferred to the company's account a few minutes ago. She asked the young man to guess the amount of money. The young man asked about the amount, and Chung Kexin happily blurted out that the transfer amounted to as much as 87 billion. There was no mistake. She carefully double-checked everything. Even by Ye Wutian's standards, this was simply an astronomical amount of money. He turned around and asked Kaixin if she knew who had transferred the entire 87 billion. Kexin replied that all they knew was that the money had come into their account from a foreign exchange. She assumed that it was another intrigue against the young man. The young man smirked and replied that he couldn't help but accept the money since it had been sent to the company account. They are doing everything right and should not refuse such a sum. Suddenly, an excited Xiaoman ran into the room and said fearfully that an official had come to their office. Ye Wutian asked who exactly paid them a visit. The worried assistant Chen Kexin explained that it was a person from the city government. Her eyes fearfully ran in different directions. It was the first time she had seen a person of such rank. As it turned out, the town governor himself had come to join their company and was invited into the negotiation room. Xiao Man obediently stood behind Kaixin, waiting for further orders. Ye Wuqian smiled and asked Minister Wang what business he was here for this time. The young man assumed that the mayor was going to close down Tianjing Company again. Wang turned pale and explained that he didn't make decisions by himself. Especially, beauty pills are important to him, and the mayor himself would like to support such a company in his city. The young man said it makes sense. The company started here, and if it flourished, the city would be better off. The mayor could not but agree with this statement. Ye Wutian looked Dongcheng's city manager straight in the eye and asked what would happen to the city if he built his company's headquarters in a completely different location. Minister Wang immediately realized what the young man was getting at and thought for a moment. He couldn't afford to let such a huge amount of money and tourist inflow out of the city. The mayor sighed and looked at the young man confusedly. He said they needed to have a serious talk. In his head, the city mayor was calculating his options. Chen Kexin took the hint and said that she still had some things to take care of. Taking Xiaoman with her, she smiled and assured the mayor that they could take their time. The girls left, slamming the door firmly behind them. Now the town governor and Utena could discuss business quietly without any more ears. The young man smirked and said that the minister was being overly mysterious and had decided to talk to him privately. Uchan asked why he had done so. The mayor was not much of a talker. He looked at the young man carefully and asked him to build his Tianjin company headquarters in his city. Uchan recalled that recently, the minister himself had almost bankrupted his company. The mayor turned pale and tearfully promised that this would not happen in the future. The young man stated that he did not need an apology. His company is gaining momentum, and any mayor would welcome him warmly. Wutian said that there was no need for him to stay in Dongcheng City. Wang loudly slammed his palm on the table, holding up the map of the city. He said that he was aware of the young man's desire to expand the company, and he knows what Ye Wutian needs right now. Unfolding the map, the mayor shouted that he was ready to allocate an area of any size. He only had one requirement: the headquarters must be located exactly in Dongcheng. Looking at the map, Wuqian immediately realized that such a huge piece of land was worth a lot of money, and he shouldn't ask for even more. A more generous offer was unlikely to come. The young man laughed strainedly and shook the mayor's hand, thanking him for his support. Wuqian hoped that Minister Wang would take care of him in the future. The land had cost the mayor a lot of money. He sighed heavily and closed his eyes, recognizing that it was at least a small price to pay to make it up to the boy. In the following days, more and more orders for pills came in. In order to meet the deadline, the young man had to close himself in his room and produce Qingcheng pills around the clock. Despite the monotony of the process, thanks to the strong support of Chung Kexin, who helped in every way possible and brewed coffee, the young man managed to produce 20,000 pills. The exhausted Ye Wutian lay on the sofa and thought that he had almost died for the sake of money, but he still managed to create as many as 20,000 pills. He didn't think he would be able to do it. Ye Wutian realized that in the future, the number of orders would only increase, and he would be even more tired. But the recipe could not be passed on to anyone. Spies could get into the company. Suddenly, someone knocked insistently on his room door. The young man reluctantly opened his eyes and swung his legs off the sofa. Ye Wuqian grudgingly asked who had come to see him. He went to open the door and was very surprised. His old acquaintance Ning Shiki stood on the threshold, and her face was a little sad. Ye Wutian was at a loss as to why Shiki would come to him. The girl looked like she was going to cry any minute. Sitsi pushed him away in tears and went inside. She asked where the wine was. The young man confusedly replied that there was wine in the kitchen. It was strange that she had only come to drink. The embarrassed Shiki turned around and shouted that this was exactly what she had come for and just wanted a drink. Ye Wutian looked at the girl in surprise and scratched the back of his head. Ning Shiki immediately went to the kitchen and started opening all the cupboards in search of wine. Wutian was confused, thinking that she didn't have to come all the way out here. After a short search, Shiki found what she wanted and frowned at the bottle. The young man shouted fearfully that this bottle was too strong. It was for medicinal tinctures. The girl was not going to listen to him and uncork the bottle. The girl didn't want to listen to him and uncork the bottle. The young man stared at his acquaintance stunned. The young man looked at his acquaintance stunned. Wutian was surprised to think that he had underestimated the girl. He didn't expect that Shiki would be able to drink the bottle at all, but she calmly drained it in one gulp. Sitsi walked toward the young man with an unsteady gait. The wine had gone to her head, and she could barely stand on her feet. Ye Wutian asked her fearfully what she wanted. Sitsi walked straight to the young man with open arms. She reeked of so much booze that one could suffocate. The girl reached Uchian and grabbed him by the collar of his shirt. Her face flushed with alcohol and embarrassment. Sitsi demanded to marry her. The young man was simply stunned with surprise. Not only did Ning Shiki break into his house and drink a bottle of strong wine, but she demanded to marry him. The young man realized that something unusual was going on, since she was generally rude to everyone. He put his arm around the girl's shoulders and asked her to explain what had happened to her. Shiki couldn't stand it and roared. Her whole body was trembling. The girl couldn't cope with her emotions. She could barely hold herself back from screaming. Sitsi pushed the young man away and grudgingly asked him whether he agreed to marry or not. Uchan replied in the negative and asked why she was asking about marriage in such a state. The girl in tears told the truth. As it turned out, her fiancé just wanted to use her and enter Ning's family. She didn't see it and took him seriously. Uchan and Sitsi sat on the steps in the kitchen and talked. The young man reminded her that regardless of his goals, her fiancé was treating her well. Sitsi shouted that everything was different now. Ye Wutian said thoughtfully that it was very difficult to get Shiki, knowing the Ning family's morals. The young man asked how her fiancé had even managed to get the girl's attention to himself. Ning Shiki blushed and replied that she actually only liked men who could defeat her, but her fiancé was among the defeated men. Ye Wutian firmly replied that he didn't want to be a backup anyway. After all, Sitsi has actually been abandoned and is looking for someone to comfort, and he can't accept that. Ye Wutian turned to her and exclaimed that Shiki should understand him correctly. The young man said that he too had a sense of dignity, but Ning Shiki could no longer hear the young man. He did not notice that the girl had fallen on her side and was sound asleep on the kitchen floor. Wutian looked at the guest in surprise. He couldn't understand what had gotten into her. She had traveled a long distance out of the blue, drank a bottle of strong wine alone, and fallen asleep as if she were at home. Ye Wutian rightly reasoned that Chen Kai-shin would hardly like it if she saw a drunken woman sleeping on their couch. But the young man couldn't leave Shiki on the street either. He decided that the best solution was to bring her back. The young man bent down and lifted the dazed girl onto his shoulders. After a while, Ye Wutian brought the girl to the Ning family's manor. The girl was terribly sleepy, and she couldn't think of anything at all. Ning Peng was quite surprised to see his young friend in the arms of his drunken daughter. He turned pale and asked the young man what it was all about. He told his father that he did not understand, because Sitsi had first come to him for a drink, and then said she wanted to marry him, and he was now confused. Ning Peng smirked slyly, and asked the young man what he himself thought about all of this. He could care less. Shiki was barely on her feet and could hardly hear them. Ye Wuqian looked at the floor and raised his head. He firmly told old man Ning that he didn't have a bride anyway and didn't care. The only question was whether Ning Peng himself would agree. The old man squinted his eyes, looked at the young man gravely, and replied that he agreed to marry his daughter to him. Ye Wutian didn't expect such a response at all. He had hoped to make a joke again. The young man confusedly asked Ning Peng if he was sure of what he was saying. Peng replied that he didn't look like a liar. Putting his arm around Shiki's shoulders, Ning Peng dragged her behind him to the back of the house and told the young man that he should think about his words. There was no need to rush to answer him. The old man slammed the door shut behind him, signaling that he had said all he had to say and needed to get on with his business. The young man continued to stare dumbfounded at the closed door. Ye Wutian suspected that Ning Peng was up to something, otherwise why would he give his granddaughter away so easily? On the other hand, the old man hadn't hinted at any favors, and it seemed normal. Walking down from the porch of the house, the young man dwells on the fact that nothing in this world is given away for free, much less Ning Peng's granddaughter. However, and just doesn't want to think anything about it. Ye Wutian stood by the side of the road and reproached himself for reaching here in Shiki's car, but didn't think about how he would get back. After thinking for a bit, the young man decided to take out his phone and call his bodyguard Chen Li to pick him up as soon as possible. Suddenly, a yellow cab stopped in front of him as if on cue. The young man was surprised and thought he was very lucky to get a cab by chance. As he got into the car, the young man laughed and told the driver that he was very lucky. They had saved him a lot of time by coming. The door slammed shut and the yellow cab carriage moved off, quickly increasing its speed. The young man paid no attention and relaxed. He got comfortable in the back seat and finally sorted out the contents of his pockets. The driver wore dark glasses and a green jacket. Ye Wutian told the driver that he drove away too fast, and the young man didn't even have time to slam the door behind him. The driver didn't even look at the young man. The young man looked at the serious driver with surprise. He could at least smile and joke, but the driver looked at the road with a serious look and remained silent. Ye Wuqian only now suspected something wrong. The driver didn't smile, didn't say a word to him, and the cab itself looked at least strange in the middle of the night in the middle of nowhere. The young man leaned over to the driver and said that he hadn't told him where to take him. He smiled and said that it was not a good idea to go somewhere unknown. The driver again remained silent as he continued driving. Ye Wutian was now certain that this cab had stopped at the Ning family mansion for a reason. He leaned over to the driver and yelled that the driver should stop the cab now. The young man was quite frightened. He didn't want to be ambushed again. The driver quickly turned to the passenger and lightning fast pulled out a gun, pointing it at the young man. The muzzle of the gun flashed in the cabin, and the young man realized that this guy wasn't going to stop. Ye Wutian was very surprised. Not only that someone was following him and his enemies had brought a car in the form of a cab. The driver was also a trained fighter. The young man reached into his sinus cavity and thought about whether it was worth the risk to use the drug. Anything could happen at such a high speed on the road. It seems the driver was well aware of his talents and recommended that he refrain from any action. At 90 miles, they would not survive. Ye Wutian said thoughtfully that his accent gave away a foreigner, but he couldn't remember anyone with that voice. The young man asked what the driver needed. The chauffeur said carelessly through gritted teeth that someone was interested in meeting Dr. Yi in person. Wutian realized that they knew exactly who they were after. Leaning back in his seat and slowly reaching into his pocket, the young man asked who wanted to see him and who they were in general. After a little thought, Wutian asked what they wanted. The driver immediately pointed a gun at him and informed him that the young man would find out everything on the spot. Besides, his phone was in his pocket and there was no need to try to retrieve it. Ye Wutian laughed nervously and said that it wasn't about the phone. He was just needing his arm, because it was uncomfortable to stay in the same position for a long time. The young man tensely reconstructed the events. It appeared that this guy was either constantly following him, or it was all set up by the Ning family. As he pondered who had started hunting for him, the cab parked in front of a large structure that had the appearance of a maze from a bird's eye view. Getting out of the car, the young man saw a tall man wearing green clothes and green shoes. The man had a green cylinder on his head. He was leaning on a wooden cane. Several men of the same height stood in a semicircle near the leader. They all wore gray pants and brown jackets. The caps pulled down over their eyes concealed their faces. The driver turned to the young man, took aim at him, and demanded that he get out of the car. Ye Wutian was forced to comply. He reluctantly opened the back left door and slowly lowered his foot to the ground, trying to get a good look at as much as he could and buy some time. As soon as Ye Wutian put both feet on the ground and straightened up, the fighters immediately surrounded him. All 5 guns were now looking at him. The man smirked approvingly. The man with the short mustache said hello to Wutian and introduced himself. His name was Ichiro Miyamoto, and he was very glad they had met. Ye Wutian took umbrage and recalled an ethnic swear word that was bestowed on the Japanese by the Chinese living in the northern part of the country. Miyamoto frowned and apologized for the young man having to be forcibly delivered. He asked to be referred to as Japanese and to refrain from making careless remarks. Ye Wutian wailed that with the level of security in China, so many people could cross the border with guns. He said these guys didn't look like foreigners at all. Miyamoto's team was well trained not to react to any provocation. The fighters stood silently and waited for instructions, taking aim at the young man. Ye Wutian shouted that he could not believe that there were many traitors in China in peacetime and pointed his finger at them. He recalled that for decades they had resisted foreigners. One of the bodyguards was pissed off, and he listened to the young man's curses unhappily. The young man was ready to shoot him even without the chief's command. Miyamoto asked Wutian to calm down. Instead of spewing curses, the young man should find out the reason why he was brought to this place.